Hi angels. This will be Threads of Trust by the Angels Dem. Chapter 1, A Shattered Home. Summary. Izuku Midoriya is adopted by Aizawa and Yamada, who offer him a stable and supportive home. Izuku adjusts to this new family dynamic, feeling both grateful and uncertain about his place in their lives. Story. Izuku Midoriya stood in front of the cold, gray headstone, the weight of the world pressing down on his small frame. The wind howled through the cemetery, biting at his cheeks and carrying with it the scent of rain. The clouds above threatened to spill over, but Izuku couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away from the name etched into the stone. Inko Midoriya. He read it again. And again. Somehow, repeating it over and over made it feel less real, like a trick of the light or a bad dream. Maybe if he just stared long enough, he could wake up. But there was no escaping the cold finality of it. His mother was gone. The weight of her absence crushed him, as though the world had taken his only source of light and left him stranded in the dark. Izuku wanted to cry, to scream, to beg for her to come back. But his tears had dried weeks ago, leaving him hollow and numb. She had been everything. His rock. His protector. Even when the world had torn him down, mocking him for his quirkless body, she had stood by him, offering him unconditional love and support. She was the one who had believed in him when no one else would. But now. He stood alone, drenched in the rain, feeling like a child again, helpless and lost. The weight of One for All, the quirk given to him by his hero, All Might, suddenly felt so much heavier than before. What was the point of all this power if he couldn't even protect the one person who mattered most? Izuku clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. His mother had been everything to him, and now she was just gone. He couldn't remember a time when his heart had felt this empty, this broken. A voice broke through the storm behind him. You shouldn't stay out here in this weather. Izuku turned, his vision blurred with rain and exhaustion. Standing a few feet behind him was his homeroom teacher, Shota Aizawa, his usual black scarf wrapped around him, soaked from the downpour. Beside him, Hisashi Yamada, present Mike, stood with his arms crossed, his ever-present grin replaced by a look of solemn concern. Sensei, what are you doing here? Izuku's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. Aizawa stepped closer, his gaze steady and unflinching, but softer than usual. We've been worried about you, Midoriya. Izuku blinked, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't told anyone at UA about what had happened, not the details. He had kept it all to himself, burying the pain deep inside, pretending that everything was fine. But the weight of that lie had become unbearable, pressing down on him with every passing day. How did you? Izuku's voice trailed off. He wasn't sure what he wanted to ask. How did they know? How did they find him? How had he let himself get to this point? Yamada stepped forward, his expression soft but serious. You're not exactly great at hiding your emotions, Izuku. Aizawa and I noticed something was wrong. We've been keeping an eye on you. Izuku swallowed hard, the reality of their words sinking in. He had been trying so hard to keep it together, to not let anyone see how much he was falling apart. But, of course, they had seen right through him. I'm fine, Izuku lied, turning back to the gravestone. The words felt empty, hollow, even to him. Aizawa sighed, stepping beside him. You're not fine, Midoriya. And that's okay. Izuku's breath hitched in his throat. He had spent so long pretending to be strong, pretending that he could handle it all on his own. But standing here, drenched in rain and grief, the truth felt inescapable. I don't know what to do, Izuku whispered, his voice barely audible. The tears that he had fought so hard to suppress, began to well up again, blurring his vision. She was all I had. The words hung in the air, heavy with pain and loss. Izuku's shoulders shook as the sobs he had been holding in finally broke free, his body trembling under the weight of it all. He sank to his knees, his hands gripping the wet earth in front of the gravestone as if somehow, holding on to the ground would keep him from falling apart completely. Aizawa and Yamada stood quietly beside him, offering no words of platitudes or meaningless comfort. They knew better than to try to fix what couldn't be fixed. Izuku's sobs echoed through the cemetery, mingling with the sound of the rain. He had been trying so hard to be strong for so long, but in this moment, the facade crumbled, leaving him raw and vulnerable. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The rain continued to pour, drenching Izuku to the bone, but he didn't care. For once, he didn't care about anything other than the overwhelming ache in his chest. Finally, Aizawa knelt down beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. His grip was firm, grounding, and somehow, it was enough to pull Izuku back from the brink. "Midoriya," Aizawa said softly, his voice low and steady, "you're not alone." Izuku looked up, his face streaked with rain and tears. I don't have anyone else. I don't have anyone left." Yamada crouched down on his other side, his usual loud energy tempered by the weight of the moment. "That's not true, Zuku. You have us." Izuku blinked, confused. "What?" Aizawa met his gaze, his eyes uncharacteristically gentle. "You don't have to do this alone. Yamada and we've been talking. We've seen how hard things have been for you. We want to help." Izuku's heart raced, his mind struggling to comprehend what they were saying. "I don't understand." Yamada smiled, though it was a sad, tired smile. "We're offering you a home, kid. With us." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Izuku's mind raced, trying to process the words, trying to make sense of the impossible offer being laid before him. "You mean, live with you?" Aizawa nodded. "Yes. We know things haven't been easy. You've been through a lot, and you need stability. A family." Izuku shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. "But I can't. I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," Yamada said firmly, his voice full of warmth. "You're part of Class 1A. You're part of our lives now. We want to help you. Not out of obligation, but because we care about you." Izuku's throat tightened. He had spent so long trying to handle everything on his own, so used to the idea that he had to face the world by himself. The thought of accepting help, of letting himself rely on someone else, felt foreign and terrifying. "I don't know if I can," Izuku whispered, his voice trembling. "You don't have to decide now," Aizawa said gently. "Just know that the offer is there. You have people who care about you. You don't have to carry this alone." Izuku wiped at his eyes, his heart aching with a mix of grief and something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. He didn't know what the future held, and the idea of stepping into a new life, a new home, with two pro-heroes who were his teachers, felt overwhelming. But as he looked up at Aizawa and Yamada, their faces full of understanding and care, something inside him shifted. Maybe he didn't have to be alone anymore. I'll think about it," Izuku said quietly, his voice barely audible over the rain. Yamada smiled and ruffled Izuku's hair, gently. "That's all we ask, Zuku." Aizawa stood, offering a hand to help Izuku to his feet. "We'll be here when you're ready." As Izuku took Aizawa's hand and rose to his feet, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. The rain still poured down around them, but it no longer felt as cold, as isolating. For the first time in what felt like forever, Izuku allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face the darkness alone. Together, the three of them walked away from the gravestone, leaving the past behind. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Izuku knew that he wasn't walking it alone. Chapter 2, The Bonding Quirk. Summary. Izuku starts realizing his secondary quirk, when he trusts someone deeply, he gains their quirk. He bonds more with Aizawa and Yamada, becoming closer to them as he understands the nature of his new power. Story. The next morning, Izuku woke up in a bed that didn't feel like his own. Sunlight filtered through the blinds of the unfamiliar room, casting soft shadows across the floor. For a few blissful seconds, he thought he was back home, in his old apartment, with his mother calling him for breakfast. But reality hit him as soon as he opened his eyes. He wasn't home. He wasn't with his mother. She was gone. Izuku stared at the ceiling, his chest tightening as the weight of it all returned. The events of the previous day flooded back into his mind, the rain, the cemetery, Aizawa and Yamada offering him a home. He had said yes, though his voice had been quiet, unsure. Now, here he was, in the guest room of their apartment, trying to make sense of how his life had changed so drastically in such a short time. A knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. Midoriya, Aizawa's familiar, gruff voice, called from the other side. Breakfast is ready. Izuku sat up, blinking as he tried to orient himself. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to someone else being there, looking out for him. There was a strange comfort in the thought, but it also made him feel a pang of guilt. He didn't deserve this, did he? Coming, sensei, he mumbled, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. As he got dressed, his mind drifted to the question that had plagued him since the day before: how was he supposed to live here, with his teachers, as if everything was normal? He wasn't normal. Nothing about this was normal. His heart still ached with the loss of his mother, and no amount of kindness from Aizawa and Yamada could change that. But, maybe this was what he needed. Maybe this was the start of something new. Izuku made his way to the kitchen, where the smell of breakfast greeted him: eggs, toast, and coffee. Yamada, dressed in casual clothes instead of his usual hero uniform, waved at him with a wide grin. Morning, Zuku. Slept okay? Yamada asked, his voice noticeably softer than it usually was when he was on the radio or in front of students. The usual boom in his tone was toned down, perhaps in an effort not to overwhelm Izuku. Yeah, Izuku lied, offering a small smile as he took a seat at the table. The truth was, he hadn't slept well at all. His mind had been too restless, too full of thoughts that refused to quiet down. Aizawa sat at the head of the table, his ever-present mug of coffee in hand. He glanced at Izuku briefly, his gaze unreadable, before looking back at the newspaper in front of him. You've got training today, Aizawa said, his tone casual, but firm. I want you to start working on your quirk control again. Izuku nodded. Yes, sensei. He had expected this. Aizawa wasn't the type to let him wallow in his grief. He would push Izuku forward, keep him moving, and maybe that was exactly what he needed. But as Izuku reached for his toast, a strange sensation washed over him, a flicker of something deep within his chest, something that made his heart skip a beat. It wasn't pain, exactly, but it was strange. Izuku froze, his hand hovering over the plate. You okay, kid? Yamada asked, raising an eyebrow. I'm fine, Izuku said quickly, shaking his head. He grabbed the toast and took a bite, trying to ignore the odd feeling that lingered in his chest. He didn't know what it was, but he didn't want to worry them. The rest of breakfast passed in relative silence, with Yamada chatting lightly about his radio show and Aizawa quietly sipping his coffee. Izuku tried to relax, but that strange sensation kept tugging at the edges of his mind, making him feel unsettled. After breakfast, Aizawa led him to the training room in the apartment, a spacious area equipped with mats, weights, and everything he needed to work on his quirk. It was far more than Izuku had ever imagined having access to, and for a moment, he felt a surge of gratitude. Aizawa and Yamada were giving him everything he needed, and he wasn't sure how to repay them. Let's see how your control is, Aizawa said, standing off to the side with his arms crossed. I want you to focus on using only 5% of one for all. No more, no less. Izuku nodded, his heart racing as he shifted into position. He had been working on controlling one for all for months now, but it was still difficult. The power inside him felt like a wild beast, waiting to be unleashed, and he had to keep it in check, or risk destroying everything around him. Taking a deep breath, Izuku activated one for all, feeling the familiar surge of energy rush through his body. His muscles tensed, the power crackling just beneath his skin. He focused, trying to keep it contained, trying to stay within the limit. Good, Aizawa said, watching him closely. Now maintain it. But just as Izuku steadied himself, that strange sensation from breakfast returned, stronger this time. It felt like a pulse, a wave of energy that wasn't his own, spreading through his chest and up into his limbs. His concentration wavered, and one for all sputtered, slipping out of control for a split second before Izuku reined it back in. Focus, Midoriya, Aizawa snapped. I am sorry. Izuku stammered, his heart pounding in his chest. I don't know what's happening. Aizawa narrowed his eyes, stepping forward. What do you mean? Izuku hesitated, unsure of how to explain it. I've been feeling something strange. It's like, there's something else inside me. Aizawa frowned, his gaze sharp. What kind of something? I don't know, Izuku admitted, his voice shaking. It's like, another energy. It's not one for all, but it's connected somehow. I don't understand it. Aizawa was silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he considered Izuku's words. Then, without warning, he activated his quirk, erasure, his hair floating up as his red eyes locked onto Izuku. For a split second, Izuku felt the familiar sensation of one for all being suppressed, but then, something shifted. That strange pulse inside him flared, and before Izuku could stop it, he felt a surge of power, erasure, Aizawa's quirk, coursing through him. Izuku gasped, stumbling back in shock. What? Aizawa's eyes widened, and his quirk deactivated immediately. What just happened? I don't know. Izuku stammered, his heart racing. I felt your quirk. It was like it was mine. Aizawa's expression darkened, his mind clearly working through the possibilities. Explain. Izuku took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. I've been feeling this energy since this morning. I don't know what it is, but when you used your quirk on me, I felt it. And then I think I used it. Aizawa stared at him, his gaze intense. That's not possible. I know. Izuku exclaimed, his voice shaky. But it happened. I don't know how, but it did. Yamada entered the room, having heard the commotion. What's going on? I heard shouting. Aizawa's quirk, Izuku said breathlessly. I think I just used it. Yamada blinked, clearly confused. Wait, what? How? I don't know, Izuku admitted, his voice small. I don't understand it. Aizawa stepped closer, his expression unreadable. Midoriya, we need to figure this out. If you're manifesting another quirk, we need to know how it works. Izuku's mind was spinning. Another quirk? Was that even possible? He already had one for all, how could he possibly have another quirk? But the evidence was right in front of him. He had used Aizawa's quirk, even if only for a moment. I'll try to figure it out, Izuku said quietly, his heart pounding in his chest. Aizawa's gaze softened slightly, though his tone remained firm. We'll help you. Yamada nodded, his usual energy returning. Don't worry, Zuku. We'll get to the bottom of this. Whatever's going on, we're in it together. Izuku swallowed hard, feeling a mixture of fear and hope. He didn't know what was happening to him, but at least he wasn't facing it alone. Chapter 3, Strength and Vulnerability. Summary. Hitoshi Shinso joins Class 1A, replacing Mineta, and begins training with Izuku. As their bond grows, Izuku's quirk allows him to gain Shinsou's mind control ability, deepening their connection. Story. Izuku couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted inside him. As he sat on the floor of the training room, wiping sweat from his brow, his mind raced, replaying the moment when he had somehow used Aizawa's quirk. It didn't make sense. He knew that quirks didn't just change like that. And yet, here he was, grappling with the impossible. Take 5, Aizawa said, his voice softer than usual. He handed Izuku a towel, but his usual sternness was still present, watching for any sign of overexertion. We're not pushing this until we understand it better. Izuku nodded, breathing heavily. He wasn't sure if the exhaustion he felt was from the training or from the storm of emotions swirling inside him. The idea of having another quirk, something that wasn't one for all, made him feel overwhelmed. He had just gotten a handle on the power All Might had passed down to him. How was he supposed to manage something like this? Yamada stepped into the room, holding a bottle of water and his usual smile. Hey, Izuku. Feeling any better? Izuku looked up at him, startled by the nickname, but the warmth in Yamada's voice helped soothe his nerves. Yeah, I guess. Yamada tossed him the water bottle, and Izuku caught it, unscrewing the cap with shaky hands. You did good today. Don't let that brain of yours spiral, okay? We'll figure this out. We always do. Izuku let out a small, nervous laugh. Always? Yamada plopped down next to him on the mat, crossing his legs. Sure. Shota and I have handled worse, haven't we? He threw a playful glance at Aizawa, who was still standing by the wall, his arms crossed. Aizawa grunted, clearly unimpressed with the teasing. We'll figure it out, he said plainly, not bothering to address Yamada's banter. Izuku appreciated the assurance, but there was something else gnawing at him. This new quirk, this bonding quirk, it didn't feel like a coincidence. There had to be something more to it, something connected to his past. A past he had kept hidden from them. A past he didn't want to talk about. But now, sitting here with Aizawa and Yamada, both of them treating him like something more than just a student, the weight of his silence felt unbearable. Sensei, Izuku started, then quickly corrected himself, Aizawa-sensei, Yamada-sensei. Shit is fine, Aizawa interrupted, his voice surprisingly soft. Yeah, and it's Hizashi for me, Yamada added with a grin. No need for all the formality, Izuku. We're family now, right? Family. The word hit Izuku like a punch to the gut. He hadn't had a family in so long, hadn't even let himself think of what it would feel like to belong somewhere again. But here, with Aizawa, no, Shoryuta, and Hizashi, the possibility of it felt real. Izuku looked down at his hands, fiddling with the cap of the water bottle. His throat tightened as he tried to find the words. He hadn't talked about this with anyone, not even All Might. But he couldn't keep running from it, not when so much was at stake. I've been thinking about this quirk, Izuku began, his voice trembling. And I think it has something to do with trust. With bonding. Shota's eyes narrowed in thought, but he didn't interrupt. I don't know how to explain it, Izuku continued, his voice barely above a whisper, but I've never really trusted anyone enough to let them in. Not fully. Not until now. And now that I'm here, with you too, I think that's why it's happening. I think that's why I'm getting these quirks. There was a heavy silence in the room, the weight of Izuku's confession hanging in the air. Hizashi was the first to speak, his tone soft but steady. You're saying your quirk, this bonding quirk, only activates when you trust someone? Izuku nodded, biting his lip. I think so. It's the only thing that makes sense. I've never been close enough to anyone to let this happen before. Shoyuta moved closer, kneeling in front of Izuku, his gaze intense but not harsh. What happened before? With your mother? Izuku flinched at the question, his heart racing. He had avoided this conversation for so long, kept everything locked away, hoping that if he ignored it, the pain would go away. But it never did. It just festered. I don't talk about her much, Izuku said, his voice shaking. She wasn't always kind. Hisashi's smile faded, and Shida's eyes softened. Go on, Shoyuta urged quietly, giving Izuku the space to continue at his own pace. Izuku took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. She wasn't abusive, not physically. But, after I didn't get a quirk, after the doctors told me I'd be quirkless, everything changed. She was disappointed. I could see it in her eyes. And it only got worse as I got older. He clenched his fists, the old memories flooding back, memories he had buried for years. She stopped supporting me. Stopped encouraging me. She'd look at me like I wasn't enough. Like I'd failed her. Izuku felt the tears welling up in his eyes, but he fought to hold them back. He didn't want to cry. Not now. Not when he was finally telling the truth. When I got One for All, when All Might gave me his quirk, I thought maybe I could finally be something. But by then, she was gone. He didn't say how she had left, whether she had died or simply disappeared, but the pain in his voice was unmistakable. I've been alone for so long, Izuku whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't think I could trust anyone again. But then you two came along, and I don't know why, but it's different. The room was silent for a long moment. Shoyuta and Hisashi exchanged a glance, one that spoke volumes. You're not alone anymore, Zuku, Hisashi said softly, resting a hand on Izuku's shoulder. We're here for you, no matter what. Shida's voice was calm, but there was a warmth in it that Izuku hadn't heard before. You don't have to carry this on your own. Whatever happened in the past, it doesn't change who you are now. You're strong, Midoriya. Stronger than you think. Izuku couldn't hold back the tears any longer. They spilled over, silent but heavy, as the weight of everything he had been holding on to for so long finally began to lift. He wasn't sure what he had expected, maybe for them to pull away, or to tell him to toughen up. But instead, they stayed with him, their presence steady and unwavering. For the first time in what felt like forever, Izuku allowed himself to lean on someone else. He allowed himself to be vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, something inside him shifted. He felt it again, that pulse of energy, that flicker of something deep within his chest. But this time it wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't frightening. It was comforting. Izuku wiped at his eyes, sniffling as he tried to regain his composure. I am sorry. Don't apologize, Shoyuta said firmly. There's nothing to be sorry for. Hisashi grinned, though it was softer than usual. Yeah, Zuku, we're family now, remember? No need for apologies. Family. Izuku's heart ached at the word, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't a painful ache. It was something different. Something warm. He looked up at them, his tears still drying on his cheeks, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. Chapter 4, The Burden of a Secret. Summary. Aizawa and Yamada help Izuku learn how to balance his original One for All with the new quirks he's acquiring. The family dynamic strengthens as Izuku grows closer to his adoptive parents. Story. The weight of the secret gnawed at Izuku, day and night. It felt like a second quirk, pressing down on him, making it harder to breathe with every passing moment. His newfound ability, this bonding quirk, was something he didn't fully understand. But what terrified him most wasn't the mystery of the power itself, it was the question of whether he could control it. Weeks had passed since that day in the training room when he had accidentally used Shida's quirk. They had tested it a few more times since then, confirming that whenever Izuku trusted someone enough, he could borrow their quirk. But the thought of what this meant, that he was essentially copying the abilities of those he bonded with, filled him with anxiety. How could he live with a quirk like that? How could he tell his friends? It was late afternoon, and Izuku stood alone in the training room, his fists clenched as he struggled to keep one for all at 5%. His muscles burned with the effort, the crackle of power racing just beneath his skin. But no matter how hard he tried to focus, his mind kept drifting back to the secret he was holding inside. He had always been open with his friends, with his classmates. But now, the thought of telling them about this new quirk made his stomach churn with dread. What would they think of him? Would they see him as a threat? As a thief? Focus, Midoriya. Shida's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts like a knife. Izuku snapped back to reality, blinking as the power of one for all flickered beneath his skin. I am sorry, Izuku stammered, panting from the effort. I can't stop thinking about it. Shoyuta stepped forward, his gaze steady and unreadable as always. What exactly can't you stop thinking about? Izuku swallowed hard, his throat dry. The quirk. The bonding quirk. What if I can't control it? What if it happens again, and I take someone else's quirk without meaning to? What if it happens in front of the class? Shida's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained calm. You're not going to lose control. But how do you know that? Izuku asked, his voice rising in frustration. I don't even know how this quirk works, and I already took your quirk once. What if? Shoyuta raised a hand, cutting him off. Calm down. Izuku bit his lip, his heart racing as the panic threatened to overwhelm him. You're not going to lose control because you know how important it is not to, Shoyuta continued, his voice firm but not harsh. That's why you train. That's why you push yourself. You've already learned how to control one for all, haven't you? Izuku nodded hesitantly, still unsure. Then you'll learn how to control this, Shoyuta said, his voice leaving no room for doubt. You're not doing this alone, Midoriya. Izuku's breath hitched in his throat. Shoyuta rarely used his full name like that anymore, not since he had told Izuku to call him by his first name. But when he did, it always carried weight. I know this is overwhelming, Shoyuta added, his tone softening just a little. But the only way to deal with this is by facing it head-on. We'll keep training. We'll keep testing your limits. And when you're ready, you'll be able to control it. Izuku nodded again, though the fear still gnawed at the edges of his mind. Shoyuta made it sound so simple, but nothing about this felt simple to him. The door to the training room opened, and Hisashi stepped in, his usual energy lighting up the room. You two still going at it in here? What's the status, Zuku? Izuku managed a small smile at the nickname. I'm trying. Hisashi walked over and slung an arm around Izuku's shoulders, his grin infectious. Of course you are. And you're doing awesome. Don't let that brain of yours get all tangled up in doubts, okay? Shoyuta and I are here to help you through this. Izuku glanced between the two of them, Shida's calm, steady presence on one side, and Hisashi's bright, unwavering optimism on the other. It was a strange balance, but somehow, it worked. And for the first time in a long while, Izuku felt the tightness in his chest loosen, if only a little. Thanks, Hisashi, Izuku said quietly, his heart warming at the sight of both of them here, supporting him. Hisashi's smile widened, and he gave Izuku's shoulder a light squeeze. No problem, Zuku. Now, what's next? More quirk training, or should we take a break and have some ice cream? Izuku blinked, momentarily thrown by the sudden shift in tone. Ice cream? Hizashi laughed, and even Shida's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. We've been at this for hours, Hizashi said, still grinning. You've earned a break, don't you think? Izuku opened his mouth to protest, but before he could argue, Shoyuta spoke up. He's right. You've pushed hard enough for today. Izuku stared at them both, a mix of surprise and gratitude swirling inside him. He had always pushed himself to his limits, always driven by the need to prove himself. But here, with them, it felt different. It wasn't just about proving something anymore, it was about growth, about trust. About finding balance. Okay, Izuku said, his voice soft but steady. Let's get some ice cream. The three of them left the training room, and for the first time in weeks, Izuku felt a small sense of peace settle over him. The weight of his secret was still there, but it didn't feel quite so heavy now. He wasn't alone in this. As they made their way to the kitchen, Izuku found himself thinking about the other members of Class 1A. What would they say if they knew about his quirk? What would they think of him? Would they understand? Or would they see him as something dangerous, someone to be feared? The questions buzzed in his mind, but for now, he let them drift to the back. He would face them eventually, just like he had faced everything else. But right now, with Shoyuta and Hizashi by his side, he felt like he could handle it. They sat around the table, sharing stories and laughing about some of the sillier moments from UA training. Izuku found himself smiling more easily than he had in days. Hizashi's energy was contagious, and Shida's quiet presence felt like a steady anchor in the chaos of Izuku's life. And as they laughed and talked, Izuku realized something important. This wasn't just training. This wasn't just about getting stronger or controlling his quirk. This was about trust. He was learning to trust them, to rely on them in ways he hadn't allowed himself to before. And that trust, that bond, was growing stronger every day. Later that night, as Izuku lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the familiar pulse of his bonding quirk flickered in his chest. But instead of fear, instead of panic, he felt calm. He didn't know exactly how this quirk worked yet, and there was still so much to figure out. But he wasn't facing it alone anymore. Shoyuta and Hizashi were there, guiding him, supporting him. And for the first time in a long time, Izuku felt like he had a family. Chapter 5, Training and Trust. Summary. Izuku struggles to manage multiple quirks simultaneously. Aizawa and Yamada guide him in controlling the mental and physical toll it takes, while Shinso continues to offer support. Story. The rhythmic hum of UA's specialized training facility filled the air, its white walls reflecting the flicker of quirks in action. Izuku stood at the center of the room, beads of sweat rolling down his forehead as he stared at the obstacle in front of him. It wasn't a villain, not a fellow student, but something far more personal. It was his own power. One for all surged through him, the energy crackling beneath his skin as he struggled to maintain control. The goal was simple, to use 5% of his quirk without breaking his focus. The execution, however, was proving to be much more difficult than he had anticipated. Keep it steady, Izuku, Shida's calm voice instructed from the side, arms crossed as he observed. His sharp eyes tracked every movement, every flicker of energy that coursed through Izuku's body. Izuku clenched his fists, trying to focus, but the strain of holding back such immense power was exhausting. One for all was like a roaring wildfire inside him, begging to be unleashed. But he couldn't let it out, not like this. He had to control it. Breathe. Focus. Izuku closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the hum of the quirk reverberating through his bones. Slowly, he exhaled, letting the energy flow through him in a more controlled stream. The power was still there, but it wasn't overwhelming anymore. It was manageable. Good, Shoyuta called out, his voice steady and reassuring. Now maintain that level. Izuku nodded, pushing himself to hold the power at 5%. His muscles burned, but he ignored the discomfort, focusing on the balance. One for all was powerful, yes, but it wasn't something he had to fear. It was something he had to understand, something he had to trust. Just like he was learning to trust the people around him. Looking strong, Zuku. Hisashi's voice boomed from the other side of the room, full of encouragement. Keep it going. Izuku felt a small surge of pride at Hisashi's words, but he didn't let it distract him. He kept his eyes focused on the task, channeling the energy into his limbs, maintaining control. This wasn't just about power anymore, it was about trust. Trust in himself, trust in his ability to control what he'd been given, and trust in the people supporting him. Minutes passed as Izuku held the energy, each second feeling like a small victory. When he finally released one for all and let the power ebb away, his body sagged with exhaustion. But he felt something else, too. Pride. He had done it. Hisashi was the first to approach, clapping him on the back with a bright grin. Nice work, Zuku. That's what I'm talking about. Izuku gave a tired smile, wiping the sweat from his brow. Thanks, Hisashi. I feel like I'm starting to get it. You're more than getting it, Hisashi said, beaming. You're crushing it. Shoyuta walked over as well, his expression calm but approving. You're improving, Midoriya. That's all that matters. Izuku's heart warmed at their praise, but there was still that lingering weight in his chest, the secret of his bonding quirk. He hadn't told anyone outside of Shoyuta and Hisashi about it, and every time he trained with One for All, the fear of losing control over this new ability gnawed at him. Hey, Hisashi said, his voice softening as if sensing Izuku's unease. What's on your mind, Zuku? Izuku hesitated, biting his lip. Should he tell them? Should he voice the worry that had been eating away at him for days? He knew they wouldn't judge him, but the fear of his own power, of what he might become if he couldn't control it, was a heavy burden to carry. I don't know if I can handle all of this, Izuku admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. One for All is already so much to manage, and now with this new quirk. I'm scared. Shuta's eyes narrowed, but not in frustration. He was listening, processing. You're scared because you don't fully understand it yet, Shoyuta said matter-of-factly. That's normal. But we've already established that this bonding quirk is connected to trust. You trust us, right? Izuku nodded without hesitation. Of course I do. Then trust yourself, Shoyuta continued, his voice unwavering. You've handled One for All so far. You've adapted. This new quirk is just another part of that. It's not a burden, Midoriya. It's an extension of you. Izuku looked down at his hands, his fingers trembling slightly from the lingering adrenaline. Could he really trust himself? Could he trust that this new ability wouldn't spiral out of control, that he wouldn't end up hurting someone he cared about? Hisashi crouched down beside him, his voice softer than usual. You're not alone, Zuku. You've got us. We'll figure it out together. But don't let fear stop you from growing, okay? Izuku blinked, feeling the warmth of their words settle in his chest. He had spent so long dealing with everything on his own, always trying to prove himself, always pushing forward, because he didn't know how to stop. But now, maybe he didn't have to do it alone. You're right, Izuku said quietly, his voice steadying. I'll keep trying. That's the spirit. Hisashi cheered, ruffling Izuku's hair, playfully. Just remember, you've got us in your corner. Shoyuta nodded, his approval evident even if his expression didn't change much. We'll continue training tomorrow. Focus on maintaining control. But don't push yourself too hard. Izuku let out a small laugh. I'll try not to. The three of them spent the rest of the evening cleaning up the training room, the atmosphere lighter than it had been earlier. Izuku felt the weight on his shoulders lift slightly, his worries less overwhelming with Shoyuta and Hizashi by his side. They were more than just mentors, they were becoming family. And with each day that passed, the bond between them grew stronger. Later that night, as Izuku lay in bed, he stared up at the ceiling, the events of the day playing over in his mind. The training had been tough, but rewarding. Shida's calm encouragement and Hizashi's boundless optimism had helped him push through his doubts. He was learning, slowly but surely, to trust himself, and to trust them. But as he closed his eyes, the flicker of his bonding quirk pulsed softly in his chest, a reminder that there was still so much he didn't know. The fear hadn't completely gone away. There was still a part of him that worried about what would happen if he lost control again. Would his friends understand if they knew? Would they be afraid of him? Would they still trust him? These were questions he couldn't answer yet. But for now, as he drifted off to sleep, he allowed himself to believe in the possibility that he didn't have to face those fears alone. Chapter 6, Strained Control. Summary. Izuku and Shinso grow closer during training sessions, building trust and friendship. As their bond deepens, Izuku realizes how much he relies on Shinsu's steady presence. Story. The familiar hum of the UA training field buzzed in Izuku's ears as he stood, panting, in the middle of the sparring ring. Sweat dripped down his brow, his muscles screaming in protest, but he didn't let up. He couldn't. One for all coursed through him, but something else, too, something deeper. The pulse of his bonding quirk was becoming more familiar, like an old friend lurking just beneath the surface. Again, Aizawa called from the sidelines, his tone firm but not unkind. Izuku nodded, clenching his fists as he refocused. He couldn't lose control now. One for all crackled beneath his skin, and with it, the weight of the other quirks he had recently acquired. So far, he had managed to keep them in check, barely. But he could feel them waiting, lingering, as if one wrong move would set them loose. Hizashi, standing next to Aizawa, gave him a thumbs up. "You're doing great, Zuku. Keep pushing." Izuku gritted his teeth, channeling the energy of one for all to 5%, just as he had practiced. But the flicker of Shida's erasure quirk lurked at the edge of his focus, along with the faint hum of Hizashi's voice quirk. It was becoming harder to keep everything contained, like juggling too many plates at once. "Midoriya, focus," Aizawa's voice grounded him again. "Breathe." Izuku took a deep breath, feeling the energy within him settle. He had to stay calm. He had to keep control. But even as he trained with Shoyuta and Hizashi, his classmates were beginning to notice the changes. The quiet stares, the whispered questions, they all added to the pressure Izuku already felt building inside him. What would they say if they knew the truth? That he wasn't just dealing with one for all, but a second quirk, a quirk that let him take on the abilities of those he trusted? He couldn't tell them. Not yet. The session ended with Aizawa signaling for him to stop. Izuku collapsed to the ground, panting heavily, his body trembling from the strain. Hizashi was at his side in an instant, handing him a bottle of water. "You're pushing hard, Zuku. Don't burn yourself out," Hizashi said, his tone serious, despite the usual upbeat smile on his face. Izuku nodded, gulping down the water. "I'm fine. I just need to keep going." Aizawa's voice cut through the moment. "You've done enough for today. We'll continue tomorrow. I don't want you collapsing before you've even gotten a handle on this." Izuku wiped the sweat from his forehead, nodding reluctantly. He knew Aizawa was right, but the pressure was becoming unbearable. Between training with one for all and now these new quirks, it was as if his body was being torn in two directions. As they left the training room, the silence between them was comfortable, but Izuku's mind was anything but. His thoughts swirled with doubt, his worries creeping in despite Shoyuta and Hizashi's support. He wasn't just a hero in training anymore. He was something else, something he didn't fully understand yet. Class 1A. The next day, as Izuku walked into class, the familiar buzz of conversation greeted him. His friends were scattered around the room, chatting about the upcoming training sessions and missions. Izuku's mind, however, was still occupied with his own struggles. "Hey, Midoriya." Izuku looked up to see Ida and Uraraka waving him over. He smiled and made his way toward them, but as he approached, he couldn't help but notice the curious looks from some of his classmates. Bakugo, especially, seemed to be eyeing him with suspicion, his sharp eyes narrowed as if trying to figure out what had changed. "What's going on with you, Deku?" Bakugo asked suddenly, his tone challenging. "You've been acting weird lately." Izuku stiffened. He hadn't expected anyone to confront him so directly, least of all Bakugo. I am fine, Kaken. Just, a lot of training." Bakugo snorted, crossing his arms. "You're hiding something. I can tell." Before Izuku could respond, a new voice interrupted. "Leave him alone, Bakugo." Izuku turned to see Hitoshi Shinso walking into the classroom, his usual cool demeanor in place. Shinso had been training with them more often now, his transfer to Class 1A still fresh. He had taken Minetta's spot, much to the relief of most of their classmates. Bakugo glared at Shinso but didn't press further. "Whatever," he muttered, walking away. "Thanks, Shinso," Izuku said, grateful for the save. Shinso shrugged. "No problem. Bakugo's a pain." Izuku smiled, though the tension in his chest didn't completely fade. "Yeah, he's just Bakugo." Shinso looked at him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You're not okay, are you?" Izuku's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected that. "What do you mean?" "I mean you've been off lately," Shinso said, his tone calm but direct. "During training, during class. Something's going on." Izuku's mind raced. Shinso had always been observant, able to pick up on the smallest details. It was part of what made him so effective in training. But still, Izuku wasn't ready to talk about his bonding quirk, not yet. "I'm just tired," Izuku said, hoping the excuse would be enough. "The extra training has been tough." Shinso didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. "Well, if you need someone to train with, I'm around. Aizawa's been working me hard too." Izuku blinked, surprised by the offer. "You want to train with me?" Shinso shrugged again. "Why not? We both could use the extra practice." Izuku felt a flicker of something warm in his chest, trust, maybe? He had spent so long feeling like he had to carry the weight of his training alone, especially with his secret quirk. But maybe Shinso could be someone he could rely on. "Yeah," Izuku said, his voice a little stronger. "I'd like that." Shinso gave a small nod, and for the first time in days, Izuku felt a little less alone. Chapter 7, Unlikely Allies. Summary. Izuku and Shinso start working together on joint missions, testing their teamwork and abilities. They begin to trust each other more, and Izuku wonders if his bond with Shinso could grow even deeper. Story. The days at UA seemed to blur together, a steady rhythm of classes, training, and missions that kept the students of Class 1A on their toes. But for Izuku, something had shifted. Training had always been tough, but now it felt like he was training for something more. It wasn't just about mastering one for all anymore, there was another layer, a more dangerous one, tied to the secret quirk that he still hadn't revealed. But then there was Shinso. Izuku hadn't expected to bond with him so quickly, especially after Shinsu's transfer to Class 1A. But the more they trained together, the more Izuku felt himself gravitating toward the purple-haired student. Shinso was calm, collected, and always seemed to know the right thing to say. There was a quiet confidence about him that Izuku admired, and as they spent more time together, that admiration began to evolve into something deeper. "You've been spacing out a lot lately, Midoriya," Shinso said, breaking through Izuku's thoughts as they stood on the UA training field, waiting for their next mission briefing. "Everything okay?" Izuku blinked, startled. He hadn't realized he'd been lost in thought. "Oh, sorry. I'm just thinking." "About what?" Shinso asked, his tone casual but curious. Izuku hesitated. Should he tell Shinso what had really been weighing on his mind? About the secret quirk that had been quietly growing inside him? He had grown closer to Shinso, and there was a part of him that wanted to trust him fully. But every time he thought about revealing his quirk, a knot of fear twisted in his chest. What if Shinso didn't understand? What if things changed between them? "Just the usual stuff," Izuku said quickly, offering a small smile. "You know, training, missions, trying to keep up." Shinso raised an eyebrow, but didn't press the issue. "Right. The usual stuff." Before Izuku could say anything else, Aizawa, Shoyuta, stepped onto the field, clipboard in hand. Hizashi was at his side, his bright grin ever present. "Listen up," Shoyuta called out, his sharp eyes scanning the small group of students assembled for the mission. "Today's task is a simple patrol, but you're still expected to stay vigilant. You'll be split into teams of 2, and each team will be responsible for a different sector of the city." Izuku glanced over at Shinso, who gave him a small nod. They had been paired together for missions before, and it was becoming clear to both of them that they made a good team. Shinsu's ability to control and manipulate opponents from a distance, combined with Izuku's speed and power, made them a formidable duo. It was almost like they balanced each other out, Shinsu's calm precision, paired with Izuku's relentless drive. Aizawa continued his briefing, explaining the details of the patrol, but Izuku's mind was already racing. These patrol missions were usually uneventful, but today felt different. There was a nervous energy buzzing in the air, something that made Izuku's skin prickle with anticipation. "Midoriya, Shinso, you're assigned to Sector 7, Shoyuta said, his gaze briefly meeting Izuku's. "Keep your comms open, and report back if you notice anything unusual." Izuku nodded, his heart thudding in his chest. Shida's presence was always reassuring, but it also reminded him of the responsibility he carried, not just with One for All, but with the new quirk he hadn't fully revealed yet. The two of them set off on their patrol, the city streets buzzing with life as people went about their day. It was strange, Izuku thought, how normal everything looked on the surface. But beneath that normalcy, there was always the threat of danger, always the possibility that a villain could appear at any moment. Shinso walked beside him, his hands in his pockets, his expression as calm as ever. "So, how's the training been going? You seem like you're handling things better lately." Izuku's stomach twisted at the question. How was he supposed to answer that? On the surface, it looked like he was getting stronger, mastering One for All just like everyone expected. But the truth was so much more complicated. He was managing not just one quirk, but several, thanks to the strange bonding ability that still made him nervous. "It's been tough," Izuku admitted, glancing over at Shinso. "But I'm learning. I just don't want to, let anyone down." Shinso shrugged, his gaze fixed ahead. "You're not going to let anyone down, Midoriya. You're one of the hardest workers in the class. But you can't keep everything bottled up, either. It'll eat you alive if you do." Izuku bit his lip, his heart racing. Shinso had a way of seeing right through him, cutting through the layers of worry and self-doubt. It was both comforting and terrifying at the same time. "I guess I just don't want to make things harder for anyone else," Izuku said quietly. Shinso glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "You're not making anything harder for anyone. If anything, you're carrying more than you need to." Izuku felt his chest tighten. Shinso was right. He had been carrying so much on his own, afraid to let anyone in, afraid to let anyone help. But now, walking beside Shinso, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to do it alone anymore. Before Izuku could respond, their comms crackled to life. Team 7, report. Do you copy? Shinso tapped the earpiece, his voice calm as ever. This is Shinso. We copy. There's been a disturbance in your area. Reports of a minor villain sighting. Stay alert. Izuku's heart jumped in his chest. A villain? He glanced over at Shinso, who was already moving, his sharp eyes scanning the street ahead. Izuku followed closely, his senses on high alert as they made their way toward the reported location. The alley they entered was narrow and dark, the walls lined with graffiti and the faint smell of smoke in the air. Izuku's heart pounded as they stepped deeper into the alley, his mind racing through the possibilities. What kind of villain could it be? And were they ready to handle it? Keep quiet, Shinso murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. We don't want to spook them. Izuku nodded, his body tense with anticipation. His muscles coiled, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Suddenly, a figure darted out from the shadows, a masked villain with a wild grin on their face. Before Izuku could react, Shinso was already moving, his voice calm and steady as he called out, "Stop." The villain froze, their body going rigid as Shinsou's quirk took hold. Izuku watched in awe as Shinsou's mind control quirk worked flawlessly, stopping the villain in their tracks with a single word. Your move, Midoriya, Shinso said, his voice calm but with a hint of amusement. Izuku blinked, snapping out of his daze. All right. With a burst of speed, Izuku lunged forward, using the controlled power of One for All, to deliver a swift, precise strike. The villain crumpled to the ground, unconscious before they even hit the pavement. Izuku stood there for a moment, catching his breath, his heart still pounding from the rush of adrenaline. Shinso walked over, giving him a small nod of approval. Nice work, Shinso said simply. Izuku smiled, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. You too. That was amazing. Shinso shrugged, but there was a small smile on his lips. Just doing my part. As they called in the report and waited for backup to arrive, Izuku couldn't help but feel a growing sense of connection to Shinso. There was something about the way they worked together, the way they seemed to understand each other without needing to say much. It was different from his other friendships, there was a depth to it, a trust that he hadn't felt before. And maybe, just maybe, Izuku was ready to let that trust grow. But even as that thought crossed his mind, the fear lingered. What would happen if Shinso knew the truth? What would happen if he found out about the bonding quirk? Would things change between them? Could he really afford to take that risk? As they headed back to UA, the weight of that question settled heavily on Izuku's shoulders. He wanted to trust Shinso fully, he really did. But the fear of what might happen if he did still held him back. For now, he would take things one step at a time. Chapter 8, New Powers, New Pressure. Summary. During a critical mission, Izuku gains Shinsou's quirk, putting more strain on his body as he tries to manage both One for All and the new abilities. Shinso helps him in the aftermath, deepening their trust. Story. The training field at UA was alive with activity as students from Class 1A moved through their exercises, testing the limits of their quirks. For most, it was another day of pushing boundaries and refining techniques. But for Izuku, every day felt like a new battle. A battle not just against his physical limits, but against the growing storm of power swirling inside him. Standing in the middle of the field, Izuku clenched his fists, feeling the familiar crackle of One for All beneath his skin. But along with that power came the now familiar hum of other quirks, Shuta's erasure, Hisashi's voice, and the overwhelming pressure of trying to keep them all in check. Focus, that was what Shoryuda had drilled into him. He needed to stay focused, to compartmentalize each power, controlling them one at a time without letting them bleed together. But the strain was becoming unbearable. "Izuku, you okay?" Uraraka called from across the field, her brow furrowed in concern. Izuku forced a smile, giving her a thumbs up. "Yeah, I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. Every muscle in his body screamed with exhaustion, and his mind felt like it was being pulled in too many directions at once. One for all, erasure, voice, they all buzzed beneath the surface, fighting for dominance, and Izuku felt like he was one misstep away from losing control entirely. He needed help. He needed someone who understood. His eyes scanned the training field, searching for the one person who had become his unlikely ally in all of this, Shinso. Shinso stood at the edge of the field, observing the other students as they moved through their drills. His expression was calm, but there was a sharpness in his gaze, a readiness that always seemed to be there, just beneath the surface. Izuku made his way over to him, his heart racing. He hadn't told Shinso the full extent of what he was dealing with yet, but he knew that if there was anyone who could help him through this, it was Shinso. "Hey," Izuku said, his voice a little breathless from the strain of training. Shinso turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "You look like you've been through the ringer." Izuku let out a small laugh. "Yeah, it's been tough." Shinso's gaze sharpened, and for a moment, Izuku felt like Shinso could see right through him, like he knew exactly what was going on beneath the surface. "You're not telling me everything," Shinso said bluntly. "What's really going on?" Izuku's stomach twisted. He had been carrying this secret for so long, afraid of what might happen if anyone knew about his bonding quirk. But with Shinso standing here, looking at him with that calm intensity, Izuku felt something shift inside him. Maybe it was time to let someone in. I've been dealing with something else," Izuku began, his voice hesitant. "It's not just one for all. There's another quirk. I think I can bond with people, take on their quirks if I trust them enough." Shinso didn't react right away, his expression unreadable. But after a long pause, he said, "And you've taken other people's quirks already?" Izuku nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over him just from saying it out loud. "Yeah. I've already got Aizawa's erasure and present mixed voice quirk. But it's getting harder to control them all at once." Shinso studied him for a moment, then nodded. "That explains why you've been so off lately. You've got too much going on." "I don't know how to manage it all," Izuku admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "Every time I use one for all, the other quirks are there, too. I'm afraid if I lose focus, I'm going to hurt someone." Shinsu's expression softened, though his tone remained steady. "You're not going to hurt anyone. You've got too much control for that." Izuku shook his head. "But what if I do? What if I—" "Stop," Shinso interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "You're not going to lose control, because you're not doing this alone. You've got people who can help you. You've got me." Izuku's heart skipped a beat at the certainty in Shinsu's voice. He wasn't used to relying on others like this, but the weight of Shinsu's words made something inside him loosen, a tension he hadn't even realized he was holding. "Thanks, Shinso," Izuku said quietly, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. Shinso shrugged, but there was a small smile on his lips. "What are friends for?" Before Izuku could respond, the ground beneath them suddenly shook, a low rumble that sent a jolt of panic through the training field. Students looked around in confusion, and Izuku's heart leapt into his throat. "What the—" Shinso started, but before he could finish, a massive explosion echoed from the far side of the field. Izuku's instincts kicked in immediately. "Come on!" The two of them sprinted toward the source of the explosion, weaving through the debris and students. The air was thick with dust and smoke, and Izuku's heart pounded as they neared the edge of the field. Villains? During training? When they arrived at the scene, the sight that greeted them sent a chill down Izuku's spine. A group of unknown assailants, villains, no doubt, stood in the middle of the field, their expressions wild with chaos. One of them, a tall figure with an energy-blasting quirk, was in the middle of charging up another attack. Midoriya! Shinso shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. We need to stop them before they take out the whole field. Izuku's mind raced, but the adrenaline coursing through him was enough to push aside the panic. He could feel one for all crackling beneath his skin, but the other quirks were there too, humming in the background, waiting to be called upon. I'll handle the big guy. Izuku shouted, charging forward. He activated one for all at 5%, his body surging with power as he rushed toward the energy-blasting villain. But just as he was about to make contact, something went wrong. One for all flared out of control, and at the same moment, Shuta's erasure quirk activated without warning, suppressing the villain's power. The sudden shift threw Izuku off balance, and for a split second, he lost control of everything. His body stumbled, and in that moment, panic surged through him. But then, Shinsou's voice rang out. Stop. The command was simple, but it hit Izuku with the force of a sledgehammer. His body froze, locked in place, by the power of Shinsou's mind control. And in that instant, something inside him shifted. He felt it, a bond, a connection, forming between him and Shinso, and before he could stop it, the familiar hum of his bonding quirk activated. Izuku gasped, his body trembling as the energy of Shinsou's quirk surged into him. It was like a door had been unlocked, and suddenly, he could feel Shinsou's mind control ability humming beneath his skin, just like erasure and voice. Shinsou's eyes widened in shock as he realized what had happened. Midoriya, what? I don't know. Izuku stammered, his heart racing. It just happened. There was no time to process it. The villain had recovered from the initial shock of erasure, and now he was charging up another blast. Izuku forced himself to move, pushing through the fear and confusion. He had no idea how to use Shinsou's quirk, but he didn't have a choice. Stop. Izuku shouted, using Shinsou's own command. The villain froze, his body locking in place as Shinsou's quirk took hold again, only this time, it was Izuku who had activated it. Shinso stared at him, wide-eyed, as the rest of the villains were quickly subdued by the other students and teachers who had arrived on the scene. Once the dust settled, Izuku and Shinso stood side by side, both of them breathing heavily from the intensity of the fight. The reality of what had just happened slowly began to sink in. You used my quirk, Shinso said quietly, his voice filled with disbelief. Izuku nodded, his heart still pounding. I didn't mean to. It just activated. Shinso was silent for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. But then, after what felt like an eternity, he gave Izuku a small nod. Well, I guess we've got a lot to talk about. Izuku smiled weakly, the weight of the new quirk settling heavily on his shoulders. There was so much they didn't understand yet, so much that needed to be figured out. But for now, there was one thing Izuku knew for sure. He wasn't alone in this anymore. Chapter 9, Facing the Past. Summary. Izuku begins having flashbacks about his life with his mother, Inko, who is no longer in his life due to past trauma. Aizawa and Yamada offer emotional support, helping Izuku confront his feelings and trust in his new family. Story. The nights were the hardest. It was in the quiet moments, after the rush of the day had passed, that the memories crept in. Izuku lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of his new room, his body heavy with exhaustion from the day's training and the battle with the villains. But despite the tiredness pulling at his limbs, sleep refused to come. His mind was a storm of thoughts, swirling with the events of the past few weeks, his bonding quirk, gaining Shinsou's ability, the growing pressure of controlling multiple powers. But beneath all of that was something darker, something he had tried to bury for years. Inko. Izuku's heart clenched painfully at the thought of his mother. He had pushed the memories of her so far down that he had almost convinced himself they didn't exist. But now, in the silence of the night, they flooded back with a vengeance. She had always been kind, at least at first. He remembered how she used to smile at him, how she would encourage him, tell him that it was okay that he didn't have a quirk. But then the disappointment had crept in, subtle at first, but unmistakable. As the years passed and Izuku remained quirkless, her smiles became fewer, her words of encouragement quieter, and the weight of her disappointment grew heavier. By the time he had gained one for all, the distance between them had already become a chasm. And then, she was gone. Whether it had been by illness, or something else, Izuku wasn't sure, but the loss had left a hole in his heart that he hadn't known how to fill. A knock at his door jolted him out of his thoughts. Izuku? It was Hisashi's voice, softer than usual. Izuku blinked, quickly wiping at his eyes. Why yeah, come in. The door creaked open, and Hisashi stepped inside, his usual grin absent, replaced by an expression of quiet concern. You okay, kid? You've been pretty quiet since the mission. Izuku swallowed hard, forcing a smile. Yeah, I'm fine. Just, tired. Hisashi raised an eyebrow, clearly not buying the excuse. He walked over to the edge of Izuku's bed, sitting down beside him. Come on, Zuku. I know when something's bugging you. What's going on? Izuku hesitated, his mind racing. He had never talked to anyone about his mother, not really. Not even All Might knew the full extent of what he had gone through with her. But now, sitting here with Hisashi, the familiar warmth of his presence so close, the weight of it all suddenly felt unbearable. I've been thinking about my mom, Izuku admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. About how things used to be. Hisashi nodded, his expression softening. Inko, right? Izuku's heart clenched at the mention of her name. He nodded, staring down at his hands. Yeah. She wasn't always happy with me. Hisashi's brow furrowed, but he didn't interrupt, giving Izuku the space to continue. She was supportive at first, when I didn't have a quirk, Izuku explained, his voice trembling slightly. But as I got older, and nothing changed. I could see it in her eyes. The disappointment. She tried to hide it, but I could feel it. Every day. Hisashi remained quiet, but the look on his face was one of understanding. He didn't push Izuku to keep talking, but his presence alone was enough to make Izuku feel safe enough to continue. I thought that when I got one for all, when I finally had a quirk, maybe it would make her proud of me again. But, she was gone before I could ever show her. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of buried pain. Izuku hadn't allowed himself to think about it for so long, but now that he had said it out loud, it felt like a dam had broken inside him. Izuku. Izuku looked up to see Shoyuta standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He hadn't even noticed him come in. Shoyuta walked over slowly, his eyes softening as he took in the sight of Izuku sitting there, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. You've been carrying this for a long time, Shoyuta said quietly, sitting on the other side of the bed. You didn't have to do it alone. Izuku's throat tightened. He hadn't realized how much he had needed to hear those words until now. He had spent so long thinking that he had to be strong on his own, that no one would understand. But now, with Shoyuta and Hisashi sitting on either side of him, the weight of it all felt a little lighter. I never wanted to let her down, Izuku whispered, his voice cracking. I always thought that if I could just be strong enough, if I could just be a hero, maybe she would have been proud of me. Shida's eyes softened even further, and for a moment, Izuku saw something in them that he hadn't seen before: compassion. Izuku, Shoyuta said, his voice calm but firm. Your worth isn't defined by your quirk. And it wasn't defined by whether or not your mother was proud of you. You're strong because of who you are, not because of the power you have. Hizashi nodded in agreement, placing a comforting hand on Izuku's shoulder. Shida's right. You're already an amazing kid, Zuku. And we're proud of you. Not just because of what you can do, but because of who you are. Izuku's chest tightened, the emotions welling up inside him until he couldn't hold them back any longer. The tears came, hot and heavy, spilling down his cheeks as years of pain and doubt finally found their release. He hadn't realized how much he had needed this, how much he had needed to be told that he was enough, just as he was. Shoyuta and Hizashi didn't say anything else. They didn't need to. They just sat with him, their presence solid and comforting, letting him cry, letting him finally release the burden he had been carrying for so long. When the tears finally slowed, Izuku wiped at his eyes, sniffling as he tried to compose himself. He felt raw, exposed, but there was also a strange sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted off his chest. Sorry, Izuku mumbled, embarrassed by his outburst. Don't apologize, Shoyuta said firmly. There's nothing to be sorry for. Hizashi smiled warmly. Yeah, Zuku. We're family now, remember? Family's here for the good, the bad, and the messy. Izuku's heart swelled at the word family. It felt strange, hearing it directed at him like that, but it also felt right. He had spent so long feeling alone, thinking that he had to carry everything by himself. But now, sitting here with Shoyuta and Hizashi, he realized something important. He wasn't alone anymore. You're not alone, Izuku, Shoyuta said, his voice softer now. You've got us. And we trust you. You don't have to carry everything by yourself. Izuku nodded, his chest tightening again, but this time it wasn't with pain. It was with something else, something warmer, something that felt like hope. Thank you, Izuku whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for everything. Shoyuta placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. You're part of this family now. We've got your back, no matter what. Hizashi grinned, ruffling Izuku's hair, playfully. Exactly. We're not going anywhere, Zuku. Izuku smiled through his tears, the warmth of their words wrapping around him like a blanket. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe again. The weight of his past, the burden of trying to live up to impossible expectations, it wasn't gone, but it was lighter now. And as he sat there with Shoyuta and Hizashi, surrounded by the quiet comfort of their presence, Izuku realized that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face the future alone. Chapter 10, Class 1A Learns the Truth. Summary. Izuku reveals his bonding quirk to a few trusted classmates, Todoroki, Ida, and Uraraka. The group grows closer as they rally around him, supporting him in his struggle to control multiple quirks. Story. The hallways of UA were filled with the usual chatter as students moved between classes, but for Izuku, everything felt different now. The weight of his secret had always been there, lurking in the back of his mind, but after weeks of managing the growing power inside him and his recent bonding with Shinsou's quirk, it felt like the burden was too much to keep to himself any longer. He had trusted Shoyuta and Hizashi, and now, Shinso knew the truth. But it wasn't just his new family and close friend who deserved to know, his classmates had always stood by him, and the time had come to let them in on the secret. As Izuku walked into the classroom, his thoughts were racing. He knew that he couldn't tell everyone all at once, Bakugo's reaction alone would be difficult to manage. But there were people he trusted. People he knew would support him, no matter what. Uraraka and Ida were already seated near the front, chatting animatedly about their training schedule. Todoroki sat a few seats away, as calm and composed as ever. These were the people who had been by his side from the start. They had faced danger together, fought against villains, and saved each other's lives more times than Izuku could count. "Hey, Midoriya!" Uraraka called, waving him over with her usual bright smile. "You okay? You look a little distracted." Izuku hesitated for a moment, then nodded, steeling himself. "Actually, can we talk? You, Ida, and Todoroki. It's important." Uraraka blinked, a hint of concern crossing her face. "Of course. What's going on?" Ida stood up immediately, always the responsible leader. "Is everything all right, Midoriya? You seem troubled." Todoroki didn't say anything, but his eyes narrowed slightly, clearly picking up on Izuku's serious tone. "I'll explain," Izuku said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Can we go somewhere private?" The three of them exchanged glances, and without a word, they followed him out of the classroom. Izuku led them to one of the empty training rooms, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew they would understand, they had to, but the fear of how they might react still gnawed at him. Once inside, Ida shut the door behind them, his expression full of concern. "Midoriya, you're clearly troubled. Whatever it is, you know you can trust us." Izuku swallowed hard, his heart racing. "Yeah, that's why I wanted to talk to you." He took a deep breath, trying to calm the swirling storm of emotions inside him. This was it. He was about to reveal the secret he had been carrying for so long, the second quirk that had turned his life upside down. I've been hiding something," Izuku began, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's about my quirk. Well, my second quirk." "Second quirk?" Uraraka repeated, her eyes wide with surprise. Todoroki's expression remained unreadable, but his focus sharpened, as if he was already piecing things together. "I didn't know about it for a long time," Izuku continued, his hands trembling slightly. "But recently, I realized that I have another quirk, besides one for all. It's called a bonding quirk. I can take on other people's quirks if I trust them enough, if we bond." The room fell into stunned silence. Izuku's heart raced as he waited for their reactions, every second feeling like an eternity. Ida was the first to speak, his voice measured, but full of concern. "Midoriya, this is quite the revelation. A second quirk that allows you to take on others' abilities? That's an incredible responsibility." "I didn't want to hide it," Izuku said quickly, his voice shaky. "But I was scared. I've been struggling with it, trying to control it. It's not just one for all anymore. I've already bonded with a few people. I have Aizawa-sensei's erasure, present mixed voice quirk, and Shinsou's mind control." Uraraka gasped, her hand covering her mouth. "You can use all of their quirks? That's amazing. But it must be so hard to control." Izuku nodded, his throat tightening. "It's been really hard. I'm trying, but sometimes it feels like too much. That's why I needed to tell you. I trust you guys, and I can't keep this a secret anymore." Todoroki, who had remained silent throughout the explanation, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of something deeper, understanding. "You've been carrying this alone for a while, haven't you?" Izuku's eyes met Todoroki's, and he nodded. "Yeah. I didn't want to burden anyone else with it. But it's been a lot." Todoroki took a step forward, his expression softening. "You're not alone, Midoriya. You never have been. We've all been through a lot together, and this doesn't change anything. We'll help you, just like you've helped us." Ida stepped closer as well, his eyes full of determination. "Absolutely. We're your friends, Midoriya. You've always supported us, and now it's our turn to support you." Whatever challenges you face, we'll face them together. Uraraka nodded eagerly, her smile bright despite the seriousness of the moment. We're with you, Deku. Always. Izuku felt a wave of emotion crash over him. He had expected fear, maybe even rejection, but instead, they had offered him nothing but support. His chest tightened, and he blinked back the tears that threatened to spill over. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. Thank you so much. Uraraka stepped forward, wrapping him in a tight hug. You don't have to thank us, silly. We're your friends. We're always going to be here for you. Ida joined them, placing a reassuring hand on Izuku's shoulder. We're proud of you, Midoriya. For trusting us, and for carrying such a heavy responsibility with such grace. Todoroki remained a step back, but there was a small smile on his lips, a rare expression of warmth. You've always been strong, Midoriya. But strength doesn't come from carrying everything alone. You can lean on us. Izuku let out a shaky breath, the relief washing over him in waves. For so long, he had felt like he had to carry this burden on his own, but now, with his friends by his side, it didn't feel quite so heavy. Thanks, Izuku said, his voice steadier now. I'll still need help controlling everything. It's a lot to manage. We'll help you train, Todoroki said simply, as if it was the most obvious solution in the world. Uraraka grinned. Yeah. We'll figure it out together. You've got the best team around, Deku. Izuku couldn't help but smile, the weight on his chest lifting even more. His friends weren't just there for him, they were ready to help him tackle this head-on. As they left the training room and returned to the classroom, Izuku felt lighter, more hopeful than he had in a long time. His secret was out, but instead of fear, all he felt was relief. His friends understood, and they were willing to stand by him, no matter what. And as they walked together, laughing and chatting as if nothing had changed, Izuku realized that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face the future alone after all. Chapter 11, The Weight of Power. Summary. Izuku starts feeling the immense pressure of handling so many quirks, fearing he might lose control. Aizawa teaches him techniques to manage the overwhelming power, while Shinso provides emotional support. Story. Izuku sat alone in the training room, his hands trembling as he stared down at them. The weight of multiple quirks surged through his body, making it difficult to focus. One for all, always present, crackled beneath his skin. But alongside it were the other quirks, Shuta's erasure, Hisashi's voice, and Shinsu's mind control, each vying for attention, demanding his control. He had trusted his friends, told them about the bonding quirk, and they had supported him. But despite their encouragement, the reality of managing multiple quirks was wearing him down. His muscles trembled, his heart raced, and the fear of losing control crept up like a shadow, ready to consume him. What if I can't handle this? The thought gnawed at him, tightening his chest. What if he hurt someone because he couldn't keep it all in check? The door to the training room creaked open, breaking through the spiral of doubt. Shoyuta stepped inside, his sharp eyes immediately locking onto Izuku. You're not training, Shoyuta said, crossing his arms as he approached. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the observation behind his words. Izuku swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. I don't know if I can do this. Shuta's expression softened as he sat down beside Izuku on the training mat. You're trying to handle too much at once. You're not going to win this battle by treating it like you have to juggle everything at the same time. Izuku blinked, confused. But if I don't keep everything in check, I might. You're overloading yourself, Shoyuta interrupted, his voice steady. You're treating all of these quirks like they're one massive power, but they're not. They're separate, and you need to handle them separately. Izuku frowned, his mind racing. He had been trying so hard to control everything at once, to make sure none of the quirks spiraled out of control. But Shoyuta was right, each quirk had its own set of rules, its own limitations. He couldn't treat them like they were all the same. I don't know how to do that, Izuku admitted, his voice small. I'm afraid that if I lose focus, I'll hurt someone. I'll hurt you. Shida's gaze softened, and he placed a hand on Izuku's shoulder. You're not going to hurt anyone, Izuku. You've already proven you can control one for all, and that's one of the hardest quirks to manage. But you need to stop thinking you have to master them all at the same time. Izuku's heart raced as Shida's words sank in. How do I separate them? Shoyuta stood up, offering Izuku his hand to help him up as well. You focus on one at a time. Compartmentalize. Don't treat them as one overwhelming power. Treat them as tools you can use when needed. Izuku hesitated but took Shida's hand, standing up beside him. His muscles ached from the strain of the day's earlier training, but there was something about Shida's presence that grounded him, made him feel like he wasn't fighting this battle alone. Let's start with erasure, Shoyuta said, stepping back to give Izuku some space. Forget about the other quirks. Focus on this one. Izuku nodded, taking a deep breath as he tried to focus solely on erasure. The familiar pulse of power hummed within him, and for the first time in days, he managed to push aside the noise of the other quirks. Good, Shoyuta said, his voice steady. Now deactivate it. Izuku exhaled slowly, letting erasure fade away. His body relaxed, and he felt a small flicker of relief. He had done it, controlled just one quirk without the others crowding in. Shida's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. See? One step at a time. You don't need to control everything all at once. Izuku's heart swelled with gratitude. He had been so focused on the pressure, on the fear of failure, that he hadn't realized he could break it down like this, one quirk at a time. Thanks, Shoyuta, Izuku said softly, the weight on his chest lifting just a little. Shoyuta nodded. You're welcome, Izuku. But don't think this is going to be easy. Managing multiple quirks is going to take time, and you're going to mess up. That's part of the process. Izuku smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. I know. But it's better knowing I don't have to do it all at once. Hisashi's voice echoed from the doorway as he stepped into the room with his usual grin. Well, look at that. Our little Zuku's getting the hang of things, huh? Izuku laughed, the tension in his body easing as Hisashi came over to ruffle his hair. You guys are really good at this whole support thing. Hisashi winked. Of course we are. We're pros, after all. Shoyuta smirked, shaking his head. Don't let him fool you. He's just here to be loud. Hey. Loud and supportive are a package deal, Hisashi quipped, earning a small chuckle from Izuku. Shoyuta glanced back at Izuku, his expression softening once again. Let's keep working on this. I want you to practice switching between quirks, one at a time. If you feel overwhelmed, stop. Don't push yourself too far. Izuku nodded, determination filling him. With Shoyuta and Hisashi by his side, the impossible felt just a little more manageable. He still had a long way to go, there were so many powers to balance, so many moving parts, but for the first time in a while, he felt like he could breathe. They worked together for the next few hours, focusing on each quirk one by one. Shoyuta guided Izuku through deactivating erasure, controlling voice, and finding the limits of Shinsou's mind control. Each quirk presented its own challenge, but Izuku found that with patience and focus, he could manage them, separately, without overwhelming himself. By the end of the session, Izuku's body was exhausted, but his mind was clearer. The pressure hadn't gone away completely, but it was no longer suffocating him. Good work today, Shoyuta said, wiping the sweat from his brow. We'll keep at this until you've got it down. Hisashi grinned, throwing an arm around Izuku's shoulders. You're making progress, Zuku. It's all about baby steps. Izuku smiled, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't felt in a long time. He was far from mastering everything, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the power he carried. He had Shoyuta, Hisashi, and his friends by his side, and that made all the difference. Chapter 12, Hitoshi's Dilemma. Summary. Shinso struggles with Izuku gaining his mind control quirk, worried it might affect their friendship. After a heart-to-heart, they reassure each other, and their connection grows deeper, with hints of romantic feelings. Story. The sun had just begun to set, casting long shadows over the UA campus as the evening training sessions came to an end. Izuku stretched his sore muscles, exhaustion weighing him down after another long day of training. The physical strain was something he was used to, but the mental and emotional toll of managing multiple quirks was something else entirely. Even with Shuta's help, there were moments when Izuku still felt like he was drowning. But now, with the support of his friends, and the growing bond he had with Hitoshi, it didn't feel as impossible as it had before. But lately, Izuku had noticed something different about Hitoshi. Ever since the mission where Izuku had accidentally gained Hitoshi's mind control quirk, Hitoshi had been quieter, more distant. It wasn't like him. They had grown close in such a short time, training together and forming a strong partnership. But now, it was as if something was bothering him, something he wasn't saying. As Izuku packed up his things from the training room, he spotted Hitoshi leaning against the wall near the exit, his usual cool demeanor in place. But Izuku could tell something was off. Hitoshi? Izuku called softly, making his way over to him. Everything okay? Hitoshi glanced up, his expression unreadable for a moment before he shrugged. Yeah. Just thinking. Izuku frowned, his heart sinking. He had grown used to the quiet moments with Hitoshi, but this was different. There was something weighing on him, and Izuku couldn't ignore it any longer. You've been distant, Izuku said, his voice hesitant. Is it because of the quirk? The bonding? Hitoshi's eyes flickered with something, surprise, maybe, before he looked away, running a hand through his purple hair. It's complicated. Izuku felt a knot form in his chest. He had been afraid of this. The moment he had gained Hitoshi's quirk, he had worried that it might affect their relationship, that Hitoshi might feel uneasy or even resentful about it. And now, it seemed like those fears were coming true. You're worried about the bonding quirk, Izuku said quietly, his heart pounding. Aren't you? Hitoshi let out a long sigh, his shoulders slumping slightly. Yeah. I guess I am. Izuku's stomach twisted. He had hoped that their bond would only strengthen after everything they had been through, but now it felt like it was creating distance between them. He needed to understand why. I didn't ask for this quirk, Izuku said, his voice soft but steady. I never wanted to take your power from you. It just happened. But I don't want this to change anything between us. Hitoshi shook his head, his expression conflicted. It's not that I'm angry, Izuku. I know it wasn't intentional. But mind control is such a personal quirk. It's tied to who I am, to the way people see me. And now that you have it too. I don't know, it feels weird. Izuku took a step closer, his heart aching at the vulnerability in Hitoshi's voice. I get it. You've worked so hard to prove yourself, to show everyone that you're more than your quirk. And now I've taken that part of you, without meaning to. Hitoshi crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. Exactly. It's not about you, Izuku. It's about me. I've spent so much of my life fighting against the way people look at me because of this quirk. And now that you have it, I don't know what that means for me. Izuku's throat tightened. He understood the weight Hitoshi was carrying, the fear of losing control, of being defined by a power that people misunderstood. And now, Izuku had that same power. It made sense that Hitoshi would feel uneasy about it. But there was more to it than just the quirk. Izuku knew that their connection ran deeper than that. And he wasn't about to let this create a wall between them. "I'm not you, Hitoshi," Izuku said gently, stepping even closer. "No one could ever take your place. Your quirk, it's part of who you are, but it doesn't define you. You've proven that over and over again. And having your quirk doesn't change the way I see you. It only makes me respect you more." Hitoshi's eyes softened slightly, though the conflict still lingered in his gaze. "But what if this messes things up between us? What if it changes how we work together? What if?" Izuku took a deep breath, the weight of Hitoshi's fears settling into him. "It won't. Because I trust you, Hitoshi. I trust you more than anyone. You've helped me get through this whole mess with my quirks, and I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose us." Hitoshi's breath caught, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The air between them felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. There had always been a connection between them, something that went beyond their quirks, beyond their training. But now, standing here in the quiet of the training room, that connection felt more real than ever. "You trust me?" Hitoshi asked, his voice low. Izuku nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Yeah. I trust you completely." The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of everything unsaid. And then, slowly, Hitoshi let out a long breath, his shoulders relaxing just a little. "I trust you too," he said softly, his gaze meeting Izuku's. "I'm just not used to this. Letting people in." Izuku smiled, his heart swelling with warmth. "Me neither. But we don't have to figure it out all at once. We can take it slow. Together." Hitoshi's lips quirked into a small, hesitant smile, and the tension in the room began to ease. "Yeah. Together." They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, the weight of their fears slowly lifting. There was still so much to figure out, so much uncertainty about the future. But for now, they had each other. Izuku reached out, his hand brushing against Hitoshi's. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a promise that they wouldn't face this alone. Hitoshi glanced down at their hands, his eyes widening slightly, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he gave Izuku a small nod, the corners of his mouth lifting into a genuine smile. "I guess this means we're officially partners now," Hitoshi said, his tone light but with an edge of sincerity. Izuku grinned, the warmth in his chest spreading. "Yeah. Partners." But as they stood there, side by side, Izuku couldn't help but feel that this was more than just a partnership. There was something deeper growing between them, something that went beyond trust and friendship. Maybe, just maybe, it was something else entirely. Chapter 13, A Battle of Wills. Summary. During a high-stakes mission, Izuku must use his bonded quirks alongside One for All to defeat a group of villains. Shinso, Aizawa, and Yamada fight beside him, trusting Izuku as their teamwork is tested. Story. The air was thick with tension as Izuku, Shoyuta, Hizashi, and Shinso stood at the edge of the city, watching the chaos unfold. The mission had escalated quickly. What had started as a standard patrol had turned into a full-scale villain attack. Smoke rose in plumes from several damaged buildings, and the sound of distant explosions echoed through the streets. Izuku's heart raced as he took in the scene. This wasn't just another training exercise. Civilians were at risk, and the villains they were up against were powerful, far more dangerous than anything he'd faced recently. "We need to split up," Shoyuta said, his voice calm but commanding. His eyes scanned the battlefield, already assessing the best course of action. Hisashi, take the west side. I'll cover the east. Midoriya, Shinso, you're with me. Izuku nodded, adrenaline already coursing through his veins. He had fought in high-stakes battles before, but this one felt different. This time, he wasn't just relying on one for all. He had the bonded Quirks, Shida's erasure, Hisashi's voice, and Shinsu's mind control at his disposal, and the pressure to use them correctly was immense. Hisashi gave him a quick thumbs up before rushing off toward the west, his usual light-hearted demeanor replaced by a laser focus that only appeared during serious situations. Izuku watched him for a moment before turning back to Shoyuta, who was already moving. Stay close and stay sharp, Shoyuta said as they made their way toward the east side of the city, Shinso flanking them. We're going to need to work together to take these villains down. Izuku's mind raced as they moved through the rubble-strewn streets. The pressure of having to manage multiple quirks at once weighed heavily on him. He had been training, compartmentalizing each quirk as Shoyuta had taught him, but this was different. This was a real battle, and the stakes couldn't be higher. As they rounded a corner, Izuku's heart leapt into his throat. A group of villains, 6 in total, stood in the center of the street, their attention focused on causing as much destruction as possible. One of them, a towering figure with an energy-based quirk, was charging up for another attack, his glowing hands aimed at a nearby building filled with civilians. We have to stop him, Izuku said, his voice tight with urgency. Shinso, you take the lead, Shoyuta ordered, his red eyes glowing as he activated erasure on the villains. Midoriya, use your quirks carefully. Don't overload yourself. Izuku nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. Shinso stepped forward, his calm presence grounding Izuku in the chaos. Hey! Shinso called out, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Stop. The lead villain turned, his body freezing under the weight of Shinsu's mind control. For a brief moment, the street went still, and Izuku felt a flicker of hope. They had an opening. Now, Izuku. Shoyuta barked, his eyes trained on the other villains, keeping them in check with erasure. Izuku's body moved before he had time to think. He activated one for all at 5%, his muscles surging with power as he launched himself toward the frozen villain. But even as he charged, he felt the pulse of the other quirks, Shida's erasure, Hisashi's voice, waiting beneath the surface. He had to be careful. One wrong move, and he could lose control. With a burst of speed, Izuku closed the distance, delivering a precise, controlled punch to the villain's midsection. The force of the blow knocked the villain back, sending him crashing into the side of a building. The remaining villains, no longer affected by Shinsu's control, turned toward Izuku, their eyes filled with rage. Take them out quickly, Shoyuta ordered, his gaze flicking between the villains. Don't give them a chance to regroup. Izuku gritted his teeth, focusing on the villains in front of him. There were still 5 left, and each one had a dangerous quirk that could cause massive damage if not contained. The next villain, a woman with a quirk that allowed her to manipulate metal, raised her hands, summoning chunks of debris from the nearby buildings. Sharp pieces of steel and concrete floated in the air, ready to strike. Get down! Shoyuta shouted, activating his erasure quirk on her just in time. The floating debris clattered to the ground as her quirk was deactivated, giving Izuku the opening he needed. He charged forward, dodging the falling debris and activating Hisashi's voice quirk. His voice amplified, sending a powerful sonic blast toward the villain, knocking her off her feet. The force of the blast rattled Izuku's bones, the unfamiliar power surging through him. He hadn't used Hisashi's quirk much in training, and controlling it during a fight was even more difficult than he'd imagined. But he couldn't stop now. There were still 4 villains left. Keep moving. Shoyuta urged, taking down another villain with his capture weapon, his movements precise and deadly. Izuku's breath came in short, ragged bursts as he forced himself to focus. The remaining villains closed in, their eyes filled with malice. Izuku felt the familiar pulse of panic rising in his chest. There were too many quirks, too many powers pulling at him all at once. But then he felt it, a steadying presence beside him. Hitoshi. You've got this, Izuku, Hitoshi said, his voice calm but firm. We'll handle them together. Izuku nodded, the warmth of Hitoshi's trust anchoring him in the moment. He couldn't afford to lose control now. He had to trust himself, just as Hitoshi and Shoyuta trusted him. With renewed focus, Izuku charged forward, activating one for all at 5%. The next villain, a man with a flame-based quirk, sent a wave of fire toward him, but Izuku was faster. He dodged the attack, using Shuta's erasure to nullify the flames before they could do any real damage. At the same time, Shinso activated his mind control on one of the remaining villains, freezing them in place just long enough for Izuku to deliver a final blow. The last two villains, seeing their comrades defeated, tried to flee, but they didn't get far. Shuta's capture weapon wrapped around them in seconds, immobilizing them. It was over. Izuku stood in the middle of the street, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The battle had been intense, pushing him to his limits, both physically and mentally. But he had done it. He had used each of the bonded quirks without losing control. He had fought alongside Shoyuta, Hisashi, and Hitoshi, and together, they had won. You okay, Izuku? Hitoshi asked, stepping up beside him, his expression a mixture of concern and pride. Izuku nodded, wiping the sweat from his forehead. Yeah. I'm okay. Shoyuta approached, his gaze sharp but approving. You did well, Izuku. You kept your head, even under pressure. Hisashi returned from the west side, his usual grin back in place. Nice work, Izuku. We really kicked some butt out there. Izuku smiled, the warmth of their support filling him with a sense of accomplishment. The battle had tested everything he had been working toward, his control over the bonded quirks, his trust in himself and his team, but he had come through it stronger. As they regrouped, the weight of the battle still lingering in the air, Izuku realized something important: he wasn't fighting alone anymore. He had Shoyuta, Hisashi, and Hitoshi by his side, and together, they were unstoppable. Chapter 14, A New Understanding. Summary. After the battle, Izuku reflects on his quirk and realizes that its true strength lies in the trust and relationships he's built. He grows closer to Shinso, Aizawa, and Yamada, understanding that he isn't alone. Story. The evening sky was painted in soft shades of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the UA campus. Izuku stood on one of the balconies overlooking the training field, his body still buzzing with the aftereffects of the battle. His muscles ached, and the weight of his quirks felt heavier than ever, but there was something else beneath the physical exhaustion, something quieter, but no less powerful. Trust. It had been a few hours since the mission ended. The villains were subdued, and the city was safe once again. Izuku had fought with everything he had, using not just one for all, but the quirks he had bonded with, Shuta's erasure, Hisashi's voice, and Hitoshi's mind control. But as he stood here, the battle behind him, he realized that the power of his bonding quirk wasn't just about taking on other abilities. It was about connection. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath as he let that realization settle into him. His quirk had brought him closer to the people he trusted the most. It wasn't just about the physical abilities he gained, it was about the relationships that had formed because of it. The trust he had built with Shoyuta, Hisashi, and Hitoshi wasn't just a side effect of his quirk. It was the core of it. I'm not alone anymore. That thought warmed him from the inside, filling the space that had once been so full of doubt and fear. For so long, Izuku had believed that he had to carry the weight of one for all by himself. He had felt like his success as a hero depended solely on his own strength. But now, standing here after the hardest battle he had fought in a long time, he understood that true strength didn't come from going it alone. It came from trust. He had trusted Shoyuta to guide him, to teach him how to control his quirks. He had trusted Hisashi to support him, to help him find the joy and confidence in his abilities. And he had trusted Hitoshi, allowing him to see his vulnerabilities and fears without judgment. Those bonds had given Izuku more than just power, they had given him family. The sound of footsteps broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see Hitoshi walking toward him, his hands in his pockets and his usual calm demeanor in place. But there was something softer in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. "Hey," Hitoshi said, leaning against the railing beside Izuku. "You've been quiet since the mission." Izuku smiled, turning back to look out over the campus. "Just thinking." "About?" "Everything, I guess," Izuku said softly. "The battle, my quirk, you." Hitoshi raised an eyebrow, but there was a small smile on his lips. "Me?" Izuku laughed quietly, feeling the warmth of their growing bond settle into his chest. "Yeah. About how much things have changed since we started training together. About how much you've helped me." Hitoshi shifted slightly, his expression unreadable for a moment. "You've helped me too, Izuku. More than you realize." Izuku's heart swelled at the sincerity in Hitoshi's voice. There was something about hearing those words from him that made everything feel more real. Their bond wasn't just about quirks or training, it was about trust. And that trust had given Izuku the strength to face his fears, to push through the overwhelming pressure of his power. "I guess I've realized something," Izuku said after a moment, his voice quiet but steady. "My quirk, it's not just about gaining other people's abilities. It's about building connections. Trusting people." Hitoshi looked at him, his gaze thoughtful. "That makes sense. Your quirk is tied to who you are. You've always been someone who brings people together, even if you don't realize it." Izuku blinked, surprised by Hitoshi's words. He had never thought of himself that way, but maybe there was some truth to it. His whole journey as a hero had been about forming bonds, whether it was with his classmates, his teachers, or even All Might. And now, those bonds had grown into something even deeper. "I never really thought about it like that," Izuku admitted, his voice soft. "But I think you're right." Hitoshi smiled, his eyes warm. "You're good at trusting people, Izuku. Even when it's hard." Izuku's heart raced, the weight of Hitoshi's words settling into him. There was something deeper in Hitoshi's voice, something that made Izuku feel closer to him than ever before. And it wasn't just about the battle or their quirks, it was about everything they had been through together. Before Izuku could respond, the sound of more footsteps caught his attention. He turned to see Shoyuta and Hisashi approaching, both of them looking relaxed after the intensity of the mission. "There you are," Hisashi said with a grin, his usual energy back in full force. "We've been looking for you, Zuku." Shoyuta gave a small nod, his expression softening as he took in the sight of Izuku and Hitoshi together. "You handled yourself well today." Izuku smiled, the warmth of their approval filling him with a sense of pride. "Thanks, Shoyuta. I couldn't have done it without you guys." Shoyuta raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "You're stronger than you think, Izuku. You've proven that time and time again. But strength isn't just about power, it's about knowing when to rely on others." Izuku nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. "I know that now. You've all helped me realize that." Hisashi threw an arm around Izuku's shoulders, pulling him into a playful hug. "Of course we did. We're a family, Zuku. That's what family does." Izuku laughed, the sound light and full of joy. For the first time in a long time, the weight of his quirks didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a gift that had brought him closer to the people he trusted most. As they stood there together, watching the last rays of sunlight fade into the night, Izuku felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had spent so much of his life believing that his worth was tied to his power, that his success as a hero depended on how strong he could become. But now, he understood that true strength wasn't just about power. It was about trust. About family. About the bonds he had built with Shoyuta, Hisashi, and Hitoshi. And as they laughed together, the night sky above them, Izuku knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he wouldn't face them alone. He had a family now, a family he trusted completely. And that was all the strength he needed. Chapter 15, The UA Sports Festival. Summary. At the UA Sports Festival, Izuku competes with his new quirks, showing off his growth and confidence. Shinso participates as well, and their bond deepens as they compete together and support each other. Story. The energy in the stadium was electric. UA High's annual sports festival was in full swing, and the excitement from the crowd could be felt in every corner of the arena. The event that showcased the best and brightest of the students was always a major spectacle, but this year, for Izuku, it felt even more significant. Standing in the middle of the stadium, surrounded by his classmates, Izuku took a deep breath and tried to center himself. The last time he'd competed in the sports festival, it had been a whirlwind of nerves and uncertainty. He'd been trying to prove himself, to show that he had what it took to be a hero. But now, things were different. This year, Izuku wasn't just relying on one for all. He had new quirks at his disposal, powers he'd gained through the bonds he'd formed with Shoyuta, Hisashi, and Hitoshi. And more than that, he had a stronger sense of who he was. He'd come to understand that the true power of his bonding quirk wasn't just about the abilities he gained, it was about the connections he built with the people around him. He glanced to his left, where Hitoshi Shinso stood beside him, his usual calm expression in place, but there was something softer in his eyes. The two had grown close over the past few months, their bond deepening with every challenge they faced together. Today wasn't just about competition, it was about showing how far they'd come. "You ready for this?" Hitoshi asked, his voice quiet but full of determination. Izuku smiled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. "Yeah. This time. I think I'm actually ready." Hitoshi smirked, his eyes glinting with something that looked almost like pride. "Good. Let's give them a show, then." The first event, the obstacle course, was about to begin, and Izuku's muscles tensed with anticipation. He could feel the buzz of excitement from the crowd, the weight of so many eyes watching him. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt grounded. He wasn't just competing to prove himself anymore. He was here to show how much he'd grown, not just in strength, but in the trust he had built with the people around him. The buzzer sounded, and they were off. Izuku activated One for All, his body surging forward with controlled power. The first obstacle, a series of towering walls, loomed ahead, but Izuku's mind was clear. He pushed off the ground, using the force of One for All, to propel himself over the walls in a single leap. As he landed, he glanced over his shoulder to see Hitoshi keeping pace, his movements precise and calculated. There was no doubt in Izuku's mind that they made a formidable team, even in competition. The next obstacle, a massive pit filled with shifting platforms, required more finesse. Izuku focused, calling on Shuta's erasure to deactivate the quirks of a few students ahead of him who were using flight or levitation to make the crossing easier. With their quirks neutralized, they stumbled, giving Izuku the opportunity to move ahead. Hitoshi was right behind him, his sharp eyes watching for any openings. As they reached the middle of the course, where the platforms were most unstable, Izuku felt the familiar hum of Hisashi's voice quirk beneath his skin. He activated it, sending a shockwave of sound that momentarily destabilized the platforms, making it harder for the competitors behind him to keep their balance. Nice move, Hitoshi called, leaping from one platform to the next with ease. Izuku grinned, the thrill of the competition energizing him. But even as they continued through the course, there was no sense of rivalry between them. It wasn't about beating each other, it was about pushing each other to be better. As they neared the final stretch, the sound of the crowd's cheers grew louder. The last obstacle was the trickiest, a set of spinning, suspended ropes that required both agility and timing. Izuku could feel the pressure building, but instead of panicking, he took a deep breath, reminding himself of everything Shoyuda had taught him. Trust your instincts, Shuda's voice echoed in his mind. You've trained for this. Izuku nodded to himself, focusing on the ropes ahead. He activated one for all at just the right moment, launching himself into the air and grabbing hold of one of the ropes. His body swung forward, the momentum carrying him toward the finish line. Hitoshi followed, his movements smooth and controlled. As they both cleared the final obstacle and sprinted toward the finish, Izuku felt a surge of pride. They had done it. They crossed the finish line almost simultaneously, the crowd erupting in applause. Izuku's heart raced, but it wasn't from the physical exertion. It was from the overwhelming sense of accomplishment, not just for himself, but for the bond he'd built with Hitoshi, and with Shoyuda and Hisashi as well. Panting, Izuku turned to Hitoshi, who was grinning, despite his usual composed demeanor. That was close, Hitoshi said, his voice full of satisfaction. Izuku laughed, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. Yeah. But we made it. The announcer's voice boomed over the speakers, praising the incredible displays of quirk mastery and teamwork. But Izuku barely heard it. His mind was still buzzing with the excitement of the race, and with the realization of how far he had come since his first sports festival. He had used multiple quirks without losing control, relied on the bond he had formed with Hitoshi, and trusted in his own abilities. For the first time in a long time, Izuku felt truly confident in who he was, not just as a hero in training, but as someone who had built real, meaningful connections with the people around him. As they made their way back to the locker rooms, Hitoshi gave him a nudge. You did good out there, Izuku. Izuku smiled, feeling warmth spread through him. Thanks. You too. Hitoshi smirked, his eyes glinting with something more. We're getting stronger together, you know. This bond we've got, it's only going to keep growing. Izuku's heart skipped a beat at the sincerity in Hitoshi's voice. There was something deeper in those words, something that hinted at more than just a competitive partnership. Their bond had grown beyond quirks, beyond training. It had become something personal, something meaningful. Yeah, Izuku said softly, his eyes meeting Hitoshi's. We are. As they stepped back into the locker room, the noise of the crowd fading behind them, Izuku felt a sense of peace settle over him. The sports festival had been a test of his abilities, but more than that, it had been a testament to how much he had grown, not just as a hero, but as a person. He wasn't alone anymore. He had people he could trust, people who believed in him. And that was more powerful than any quirk he could ever gain. Chapter 16, Confronting Shadows. Summary. A new villain targets Izuku for his bonding quirk, threatening the trust he's built with his friends and family. During the battle, Izuku bonds with Todoroki, gaining another quirk and strengthening their connection. Story. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the UA campus. Izuku had always felt a sense of safety within the school's walls, but tonight, there was a tension in the air that sent a chill down his spine. The quiet was too thick, too still. Something was wrong. Izuku stood by one of the training fields, his heart heavy with the weight of his thoughts. The sports festival had gone incredibly well, but now that the excitement had faded, he was left with a gnawing feeling that something dark was on the horizon. Shoyuda had always taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, his instincts were screaming that danger was near. As if in answer to his fears, the sound of an explosion tore through the night. Izuku's head snapped toward the direction of the blast, his heart racing as he saw smoke rising from the edge of the campus. Without a second thought, he activated One for All, his legs propelling him toward the chaos with blinding speed. He didn't need to wait for an explanation. His friends, his classmates, were in danger, and he had to protect them. By the time Izuku arrived at the scene, the courtyard was already a mess. Buildings were damaged, debris scattered across the ground, and the sound of distant screams echoed through the air. But it wasn't the destruction that froze Izuku in place, it was the figure standing in the center of it all. A villain, cloaked in darkness, his face hidden beneath a tattered hood, stood at the heart of the chaos. His presence was unnerving, as if the very air around him had turned cold. But what struck Izuku the most was the way the villain's eyes locked onto him with an unsettling intensity. "I've been looking for you, Midoriya Izuku," the villain said, his voice low and sinister. "The boy with the bonding quirk. You're the key to my plan." Izuku's blood ran cold. His bonding quirk? How did this villain know about it? The quirk wasn't widely known, it was something he had only shared with a handful of people. His mind raced as he tried to piece together how this villain had discovered his secret, but there was no time to dwell on it. The villain had come for him, and he couldn't let him succeed. "Whatever you're planning, it's not going to work," Izuku shouted, his fists clenched as One for All crackled beneath his skin. "I won't let you hurt anyone." The villain let out a dark, mirthless laugh. "It's not about hurting, boy. It's about control. Your quirk, your ability to bond with others and take on their powers, that's what I need. And I'm going to take it, whether you like it or not." Izuku's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't let this villain gain control of his quirk. He couldn't even imagine the kind of destruction someone with such malevolent intent could cause if they had the power to steal others' abilities. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about everyone he had bonded with. Shoyuta, Hisashi, Hitoshi, they were all at risk. Just as Izuku braced himself to fight, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Izuku." Todoroki and Ida appeared at his side, their expressions hard with determination. The sight of them filled Izuku with relief, but it also solidified what was at stake. His friends were in danger, and this villain wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. "Todoroki." "Ida." Izuku called, his voice filled with urgency. "This villain, he's after my quirk. He wants to take it." Todoroki's eyes narrowed, his icy breath visible in the cold night air. "Then we'll stop him. Together." Ida's engines revved with a low hum, his hand resting on Izuku's shoulder. "We won't let him take anything from you, Midoriya. Not your quirk, and certainly not your trust in us." The villain tilted his head, a twisted grin spreading across his face. "Ah, your little friends have come to protect you. How quaint." Before Izuku could respond, the villain raised his hand, dark tendrils of energy spiraling out from his fingertips. They snaked through the air, lashing out toward Izuku and his friends with terrifying speed. Izuku's muscles tensed as he leapt into action, dodging the attack and activating One for All to close the distance between him and the villain. But the villain was fast, faster than Izuku expected. He sidestepped Izuku's punch with ease, his tendrils whipping through the air and wrapping around Izuku's arm. A surge of cold energy shot through him, and for a moment, Izuku felt something tugging at his quirks, as if the villain was trying to pull them out of him. "Izuku!" Todoroki shouted, his voice laced with concern. Without hesitation, he activated his ice quirk, sending a wave of frost crashing toward the villain. The tendrils recoiled, retreating from Izuku just in time for him to break free. He stumbled back, his breath coming in short gasps as he tried to regain his composure. "We need to be careful," Ida said, stepping in front of Izuku protectively. "He's not just after you, he's trying to steal your quirks." Todoroki's gaze hardened, and his left side began to heat up as flames licked along his arm. Then we won't give him the chance. The three of them moved together, attacking in unison. Todoroki unleashed a combination of ice and fire, creating a chaotic storm of elements that forced the villain to backpedal. Ida charged forward, his engines roaring as he delivered a powerful kick aimed at the villain's side. Izuku, still catching his breath, realized that this wasn't just a physical fight. The villain's power, whatever it was, wasn't like anything he had encountered before. He could feel the pull of his quirks whenever the villain got too close, as if his abilities were being siphoned away. But this wasn't the time for fear. He had Todoroki and Ida by his side, and he had to trust in them just as much as they trusted in him. Todoroki, Izuku called, his mind racing. Let's try something. If I bond with you, I might be able to use your quirk alongside mine. Todoroki glanced at him, his eyes widening in surprise. Are you sure? Izuku nodded, determination filling his chest. I trust you. Let's do this. Todoroki didn't hesitate. He extended his hand toward Izuku, and as their hands clasped, Izuku felt the familiar surge of energy that came with forming a new bond. His chest tightened as Todoroki's power flowed into him, the icy cold and searing heat of his quirk mingling with the raw power of One for All. The villain, sensing the shift in energy, snarled and lunged toward them, but it was too late. Izuku activated One for All, combining it with Todoroki's ice and fire. A burst of freezing wind shot from his left hand while a wave of flames erupted from his right, creating a powerful vortex of opposing forces. The villain staggered, caught off guard by the sheer intensity of the attack. For a moment, he faltered, the tendrils of energy receding as he struggled to regain control. Izuku didn't let up. He pushed harder, drawing on both his quirks and Todoroki's, forcing the villain back with a final, overwhelming blast. The villain let out a furious scream before disappearing into the darkness, retreating before he could complete his twisted plan. Panting, Izuku collapsed to his knees, the weight of the battle finally catching up to him. Todoroki and Ida rushed to his side, their faces full of concern. You did it, Midoriya, Ida said, his voice filled with admiration. You stopped him. Izuku smiled weakly, his body trembling from the strain. I didn't do it alone. We did it together. As they helped him to his feet, Izuku felt a new sense of connection with Todoroki, their bond now solidified through their shared quirks. And as they made their way back toward the safety of the school, Izuku knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he could face them, with his friends, his family, and the strength of their bonds. Chapter 17, Rising Tension. Summary. The threat of the villain grows as Izuku struggles to manage multiple quirks, with the danger of losing control looming. Shinso helps Izuku train for the final confrontation, and their bond deepens. Story. The days following the confrontation with the shadowy villain were tense. The air around UA felt charged with a palpable sense of unease, like the calm before a storm. Everyone knew the villain hadn't been defeated, and even though he'd been forced to retreat, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that he would be back. Stronger. More prepared. Izuku couldn't shake the anxiety that had settled deep in his chest. He stood on the roof of the dorms, looking out at the distant city lights, the weight of his responsibility heavy on his shoulders. The villain's words echoed in his mind, taunting him, reminding him that his quirk, his ability to bond and take on others' powers, was the key to the villain's plan. But how could he protect the people he cared about if the villain came for him again? I have to be stronger, the thought pulsed through him, sharper than ever. But it wasn't just about physical strength. He had to control the chaos inside him, the multiple quirks pulling at him all at once. And if he couldn't figure out how to master them, there was a real risk that he'd lose control when it mattered most. You're doing it again. Izuku's heart skipped as he turned to see Hitoshi Shinso leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed, his usual composed expression softened by concern. Doing what? Izuku asked, though he already knew the answer. Carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, Hitoshi said, walking over to join him. You don't have to do that alone, you know. Izuku let out a shaky breath, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know if I'm ready. What if the next time he comes, I can't stop him? What if I lose control? Hitoshi stayed quiet for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. You won't lose control, Izuku. You're not the same person you were when this all started. You've gotten stronger, we've gotten stronger. Izuku's chest tightened. It wasn't that he didn't trust Hitoshi, it was that the pressure of managing all these quirks was becoming overwhelming. Erasure, voice, mind control, Todoroki's ice and fire. It was like trying to juggle a dozen things at once, and every day the load seemed to grow heavier. I'm not sure if I can keep them all in check when it counts, Izuku admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. And if I can't, I might hurt someone. Someone I care about. Hitoshi's expression softened, and he took a step closer, his voice low but firm. You're not going to hurt anyone. I'm not going to let you. That's why we're doing this together, remember? Izuku looked up at him, his heart pounding. There was a steady confidence in Hitoshi's voice that made some of the weight in Izuku's chest lift. It was that same confidence that had grounded him during the sports festival, that had pushed him to keep going when he thought he couldn't. Hitoshi believed in him, and that belief was powerful. But the threat wasn't just looming, it was growing. Izuku, Hitoshi said, his tone more serious now. You need to stop thinking that controlling your quirks is something you have to do alone. You have people who want to help you. You've bonded with them for a reason. We're in this together. Izuku swallowed hard, the truth of Hitoshi's words settling over him. He had bonded with Shoyuta, Hisashi, Hitoshi, and Todoroki for a reason. They weren't just powers he'd gained, they were connections, relationships built on trust. He had to rely on those bonds, not just as a source of strength, but as a way to keep himself grounded. You're right, Izuku said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. But how do I make sure I don't mess up? How do I keep them in balance? Hitoshi sighed softly, a small smile tugging at his lips. That's why we're going to train. Harder than we ever have before. You're not going to face this villain without being ready. We're going to push until you can control everything. Izuku's eyes widened. You mean? Yeah, Hitoshi interrupted, his gaze intense. Starting tomorrow, we're doubling our training. You need to be able to switch between quirks seamlessly. And I'll be with you every step of the way. The determination in Hitoshi's voice sent a wave of warmth through Izuku. It was moments like this that reminded him just how far they had come, how much trust had been built between them. Hitoshi wasn't just training him, he was standing beside him, ready to fight by his side. Thanks, Hitoshi, Izuku said, his voice soft. I don't know what I'd do without you. Hitoshi shrugged, though the small smile on his face said more than words could. Lucky for you, you don't have to find out. The next morning, their training intensified. Shoyuta and Hisashi helped oversee their sessions, pushing Izuku to manage each of the quirks separately while switching between them rapidly. Hitoshi stood by his side, using his own mind control to help Izuku stay focused when the pressure began to mount. It wasn't easy. Izuku's body screamed with exhaustion as he pushed himself harder and harder, the strain of balancing one for all with his bonded quirks taking a toll. There were moments when he felt like he was on the verge of losing control, when the quirks threatened to pull him apart. But every time he faltered, Hitoshi was there. Focus, Izuku, Hitoshi said during one particularly grueling session, his voice steady. You've got this. Just breathe. One quirk at a time. Izuku took a deep breath, centering himself as Shuta's erasure quirk faded and he activated Hisashi's voice. He could feel the power shift inside him, the hum of the different quirks blending together, but he stayed calm. He focused on what he'd learned, on the bonds he'd built, and pushed forward. It was exhausting, but it was working. Day after day, they trained harder than ever, pushing Izuku to his limits. And with each passing day, he grew more confident in his ability to manage the quirks. He wasn't perfect yet, but he was getting closer. And through it all, his bond with Hitoshi deepened. They spent every waking moment together, training, strategizing, and preparing for the inevitable showdown. As the days passed, the tension in the air grew thicker. There were rumors that the villain had been spotted again, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Everyone at UA knew that the final confrontation was coming, and soon. But Izuku wasn't afraid anymore. Standing beside Hitoshi, his body sore but his spirit unbroken, Izuku knew that no matter what happened, they would face the threat together. His family, Shoyuta, Hizashi, and Hitoshi, had given him the strength to control the chaos inside him. And with their help, he would face the villain head-on. "We're ready," Hitoshi said one evening after another long day of training, his voice quiet but confident. "Whenever he comes, we're ready." Izuku nodded, feeling the same fire of determination burning inside him. "Yeah. We're ready." And as they stood there, side by side, the weight of the impending battle hung in the air, but this time, it didn't feel as heavy. Because they weren't fighting alone. They had each other. And together, they were stronger than ever. Chapter 18, The Final Battle. Summary. In the climactic showdown, Izuku uses everything he's learned to protect his friends and family. With his bonded Quirks and Shinsou's support, he defeats the villain, but the battle tests his trust in everyone around him. Story. The sky was dark, heavy with ominous clouds that seemed to mirror the tension hanging in the air. Izuku stood at the edge of UA High, his heart pounding in his chest as the wind whipped around him. The city below was silent, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in the distance. This was it. The moment they had been waiting for, and dreading. The villain had returned, more dangerous than ever. Reports had come in that he was headed straight for UA, ready to make his move. And this time Izuku knew there was no escaping the confrontation. He had to face him. He had to end this once and for all. Shinso stood beside him, his eyes focused on the horizon, calm but resolute. Shoyuta and Hizashi were close by, their expressions tense but determined. They had been preparing for this for weeks, training harder than ever, pushing their limits. But now, as the storm approached, the weight of what they were about to face pressed down on them. "He's coming," Shoyuta said quietly, his red eyes narrowing as he scanned the skyline. Izuku nodded, his muscles tensing with anticipation. He could feel the hum of one for all beneath his skin, mingling with the power of the other quirks he had bonded with: erasure, voice, mind control, Todoroki's ice and fire. They pulsed inside him, waiting to be called upon, but he knew he couldn't rely on raw power alone. This battle wasn't just about strength. It was about trust. "You ready for this?" Hitoshi asked, his voice low but steady. Izuku turned to him, meeting his gaze. "Yeah. I'm ready." Hitoshi's eyes softened for a moment, the tension in his face easing just a little. "We've got this, Izuku. Together." The word "together" sent a wave of warmth through Izuku's chest. He wasn't fighting alone. No matter how powerful the villain was, no matter how terrifying the threat, he had people by his side, people who believed in him, people he trusted with his life. And then, the sky darkened further, the wind picking up as a figure appeared on the horizon. The villain. He moved like a shadow, his form flickering and shifting as he approached. The dark energy that surrounded him seemed to distort the air, making it difficult to see his true form. But there was no mistaking the malevolent power radiating from him. His eyes locked onto Izuku with a chilling intensity, and the sinister grin on his face sent a shiver down Izuku's spine. "Izuku Midoriya," the villain called out, his voice echoing across the field. "The boy with the bonding quirk. You're the key to everything." Izuku's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't let the villain get inside his head. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight to protect everyone he loved. "You're not getting what you want," Izuku shouted back, his voice strong, despite the fear gnawing at him. "I won't let you hurt anyone." The villain's grin widened, his hands crackling with dark energy. "Oh, but you will, Midoriya. You've bonded with so many. All it will take is one moment of weakness, one slip, and I'll have everything I need." Without warning, the villain launched himself forward, his dark tendrils of energy whipping through the air, toward Izuku. The attack came fast, faster than Izuku expected, and for a split second, panic surged through him. But then Shida's voice cut through the chaos. "Stay focused." Izuku snapped into action, activating One for All at 5%. His body surged with power as he dodged the incoming attack, narrowly avoiding the tendrils. He could feel the pull of the villain's energy, trying to latch onto his quirks, trying to rip them from him, but he fought back. He had to control this. He had to trust in everything he'd learned. "Erasure!" Izuku called out, activating Shida's quirk. The tendrils of dark energy flickered and weakened as the villain's powers were momentarily suppressed. But the villain wasn't done. He shifted, his form darkening as he surged forward again, this time targeting Shinso. Hitoshi moved quickly, his eyes glowing as he activated his mind control, but the villain was too fast. The tendrils wrapped around him, pulling him into the air. "Hitoshi!" Izuku shouted, his heart leaping into his throat. Without thinking, Izuku activated Todoroki's ice quirk, sending a wave of frost toward the villain. The ice encased the tendrils, forcing them to release Hitoshi, who dropped to the ground, breathing heavily. "Thanks," Hitoshi said, his voice tight but grateful. Izuku nodded, the adrenaline coursing through him as he turned back to the villain. This was it. He couldn't afford to hesitate. He had to use everything he had, every quirk, every bond, to stop this threat once and for all. The villain sneered, his form shifting again as he prepared for another attack. But this time Izuku was ready. "Now!" Izuku shouted, activating Hisashi's voice quirk. His shout reverberated through the air, sending a powerful shockwave toward the villain, who staggered back under the force of the blast. With the villain momentarily disoriented, Izuku activated One for All at full power, his muscles tensing as the raw energy surged through him. He charged forward, closing the distance between them in an instant. The villain snarled, lashing out with his tendrils again, but Izuku was faster. He dodged to the side, using Shida's erasure to weaken the villain's quirk, then followed up with a blast of fire from Todoroki's quirk, creating a searing wall of flame between them. "You can't win," the villain growled, his voice distorted by the dark energy surrounding him. Izuku's heart pounded as he stood his ground, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He could feel the strain of using so many quirks at once, the danger of losing control looming over him like a shadow. But he couldn't give up. He wouldn't. "I'm not doing this alone," Izuku said, his voice steady. "I have my friends. My family." And in that moment, as the words left his mouth, something clicked inside him. It wasn't just about controlling the quirks, it was about trusting the bonds he had formed with the people he loved. The power wasn't his alone. It belonged to all of them. With renewed determination, Izuku pushed forward, using every quirk he had bonded with. Erasure to weaken the villain, voice to disorient him, mind control to hold him in place, and the raw power of One for All to deliver the final blow. The villain let out a final, furious scream as Izuku's fist connected with his chest, sending him crashing to the ground. The dark energy that had surrounded him began to dissipate, the malevolent power fading as the villain's form crumpled. For a moment, everything was still. The battle was over. Izuku stood there, panting, his body trembling from the effort. The weight of his quirks, the weight of the battle, all of it pressed down on him like a tidal wave. But he had won. They had won. Hitoshi, Shoyuta, and Hisashi rushed to his side, their faces filled with relief. "You did it, Izuku," Hitoshi said quietly, his voice full of pride. Izuku smiled, the exhaustion finally catching up to him. "We did it. Together." Chapter 19, Aftermath. Summary. After the battle, Izuku was left physically and emotionally drained. Shinso, Aizawa, and Yamada help him recover, reaffirming their bond and reminding him that he doesn't have to carry the weight of his quirks alone. Story. The battle was over, but the exhaustion clung to Izuku like a heavy weight. His muscles ached, every part of his body screaming in protest as he sat in the quiet infirmary room. The soft hum of machines filled the silence, but Izuku barely registered it. His mind was still spinning, replaying the events of the fight over and over again, the intensity of it refusing to fade. He had won, they had won. The villain had been defeated, the threat to Yue and his friends was over. But the victory felt distant now, overshadowed by the overwhelming fatigue that gripped him both physically and emotionally. I used everything I had, Izuku thought, staring down at his bandaged hands. He had pushed his body to the absolute limit, using all of his bonded quirks in a desperate attempt to protect the people he cared about. But now, sitting here in the aftermath, the weight of that responsibility felt almost unbearable. The door to the infirmary creaked open, and Izuku looked up to see Shinso standing in the doorway, his eyes filled with concern. Behind him, Aizawa and Yamada lingered, their expressions serious, but soft. They had been by his side during the battle, and now they were here again, ready to help him through this final hurdle. "Izuku," Shinso said quietly, stepping into the room. "How are you feeling?" Izuku tried to smile, but it came out weak, barely reaching his eyes. I'm okay, I guess. Just tired." "Tired is an understatement," Aizawa muttered, walking over to stand beside Shinso. "You pushed yourself harder than anyone should have to." Hisashi moved to the other side of Izuku's bed, his usual energetic demeanor muted by the seriousness of the situation. "You really went all out, Izuku. We're proud of you for everything you did. But now, you need to rest." Izuku's chest tightened at their words. He had always been driven by the need to protect others, to use his strength for the sake of his friends and family. But the truth was, even with all his power, he still felt vulnerable. And now, after everything, that vulnerability weighed on him more than ever. I didn't want to let anyone down," Izuku admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to fail." Shinsu's gaze softened as he sat down on the edge of the bed. "You didn't fail, Izuku. You did exactly what you set out to do. You protected everyone. But you don't have to carry the weight of all of this by yourself." Aizawa nodded, crossing his arms as he leaned against the wall. "You've been trying to do everything on your own for too long. It's time to accept that you don't have to." Izuku's throat tightened, the weight of their words sinking into him. He had been so focused on controlling his quirks, on mastering his powers and using them to protect those around him, that he had forgotten one crucial thing: he wasn't alone in this. "You've bonded with us," Hisashi said gently, placing a hand on Izuku's shoulder. "Not just through your quirk, but through everything we've been through together. You don't have to carry that burden alone, Izuku. We're here for you." Izuku's eyes stung with unshed tears as the reality of their words hit him. He had always known, deep down, that they cared about him, that they were his family. But now, in this moment, it became so much clearer. He didn't have to fight every battle on his own. He didn't have to bear the weight of his quirks, or the responsibility of protecting everyone, alone. Shinsu's hand rested gently on top of his. You're strong, Izuku. Stronger than you realize. But that strength doesn't just come from your quirks. It comes from the people you trust, the people who care about you. Izuku blinked, a single tear slipping down his cheek. I know. It's hard. It's hard to let go of that responsibility. Aizawa moved closer, his gaze soft but firm. You don't have to let go of it entirely. Just understand that we're here to help carry the weight when it gets too heavy. Izuku's breath hitched, the lump in his throat growing larger as he took in their words. He had spent so long thinking that he had to handle everything himself, that his power, his quirks, made him the one who had to protect everyone else. But now, sitting here with Shinso, Aizawa, and Yamada by his side, he realized that true strength wasn't about doing everything alone. It was about trusting others. Izuku, Shinso said, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. You've been there for all of us. Now it's time to let us be there for you. Izuku's chest tightened, and before he could stop them, more tears began to fall. But this time, they weren't tears of exhaustion or fear. They were tears of relief. I don't know what I'd do without you guys, Izuku whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You won't have to find out, Aizawa said softly, his gaze filled with quiet determination. We're not going anywhere. Hisashi ruffled Izuku's hair gently, his usual grin making a brief appearance. That's right, kid. We're in this together. Izuku nodded, his heart swelling with warmth as he looked at the three of them. They had been there from the start, guiding him, supporting him, helping him grow. And now, they were here to remind him that he didn't have to shoulder the burden of his powers alone. For the first time in a long time, Izuku felt like he could breathe. I'll rest, Izuku said, his voice still shaky, but more steady now. And I'll try to remember that I don't have to do this alone. Shinso gave him a small smile, the kind that held so much unspoken trust. We'll be here when you wake up. Always. As Izuku settled back into the bed, his body heavy with exhaustion, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The battle had been won, the villain defeated, but more importantly, he had learned something crucial, something that would carry him forward. He didn't have to carry the weight of his quirks alone. He didn't have to protect everyone by himself. He had his family, his friends, his bonded quirks, but more than that, he had people who loved him, who believed in him. And with them by his side, he knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 20, A New Beginning. Summary. Now confident in his quirks and relationships, Izuku looks toward the future. He and Shinso officially become a couple, and the story ends with Izuku finding peace, knowing he has a family and friends who will always support him. Story. The sun was just beginning to rise over the UA campus, casting a warm, golden glow across the grounds. The sky was clear, and a soft breeze rustled through the trees. It was a new day, a quiet, peaceful one, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Izuku felt at ease. He stood on the rooftop of the dorms, looking out over the city, with a small, content smile on his face. The weight of everything that had happened, the battles, the fear, the struggle to control his quirks, felt distant now, like a fading memory. The villain was gone, the immediate threat had passed, and Izuku had finally found something he had been searching for all along, peace. He had spent so long feeling like he had to carry the world on his shoulders, that he had to be the one to protect everyone. But now, standing here, he knew better. He had his friends, his family, people who believed in him, who supported him. He wasn't alone anymore. And that made all the difference. Enjoying the view? Izuku turned at the sound of the familiar voice and smiled as Hitoshi Shinso walked over to join him. There was something different about their interactions now, something softer, more intimate. The tension that had always existed between them, the uncertainty, the unspoken feelings, was gone. Izuku's smile grew as Shinso came to stand beside him, their shoulders brushing lightly. Yeah. It's nice. Shinso's lips quirked into a small smile, his purple eyes soft as he glanced at Izuku. You seem more relaxed than usual. Izuku laughed softly, a sound full of quiet relief. I guess I am. Everything feels different now. Like I can finally breathe. Shinso nodded, his gaze thoughtful. You've been through a lot, Izuku. More than most people could handle. But you've come out stronger because of it. Izuku's heart swelled at the sincerity in Hitoshi's voice. He had changed. He could feel it deep inside, he wasn't the same scared, uncertain kid he had been at the start of the year. He was stronger, more confident. Not just in his abilities, but in the relationships he had built, the trust he had found in others. Thanks, Izuku said quietly, his eyes meeting Shinso's. For everything. I couldn't have done it without you. Shinso shrugged, though there was a softness in his expression. You didn't need me. But I'm glad I was there anyway. The words hung in the air between them, unspoken emotions filling the silence. It had been a long journey to get here, and neither of them had been sure how things would turn out. But now, standing here, with the warmth of the rising sun on their faces, it felt right. I've been thinking, Shinso said after a moment, his voice quiet but steady. About us. Izuku's heart skipped a beat, and he looked up at Shinso, his breath catching in his chest. Yeah? Shinso nodded, his expression serious, but open. I care about you, Izuku. A lot. And after everything we've been through, I think maybe it's time to stop dancing around it. Izuku's chest tightened with emotion. He had felt the same for a while now, something deeper than friendship had grown between them, something that had been forged through trust, vulnerability, and shared battles. But hearing it out loud made it feel real. I care about you too, Izuku said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't know how to say it before, but I'm glad you said it first. A soft laugh escaped Shinso's lips, and he reached out, taking Izuku's hand in his. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. There was no rush, no urgency between them, just the quiet understanding that this was the start of something new, something that had been building for a long time. We don't have to figure everything out right away, Shinso said, his tone gentle. We'll take it one step at a time. Izuku nodded, his heart full as he squeezed Shinso's hand. Yeah. One step at a time. As they stood there, hand in hand, the world felt calm and quiet. There were still challenges ahead, there always would be, but for the first time in a long time, Izuku felt ready. He had Shinso by his side, and more than that, he had a family who would always support him. The door to the rooftop creaked open, and Izuku turned to see Aizawa and Yamada stepping out to join them. Aizawa's usual stoic expression softened slightly as he took in the sight of Izuku and Shinso, while Yamada grinned brightly, his eyes twinkling with amusement. Hey, look at you two. Hisashi teased, crossing his arms with a playful smirk. Holding hands already, huh? Izuku blushed, but he didn't pull away. He didn't feel the need to hide anymore, not from them. We were just talking, Izuku said, trying to fight the embarrassment creeping up his neck. Aizawa raised an eyebrow, but his expression was more approving than anything. Just talking, huh? Shinso rolled his eyes, but didn't let go of Izuku's hand. Yeah, just talking. For now. Hisashi laughed, clapping a hand on Aizawa's shoulder. See, Shoyuta? They're just like us. Aizawa sighed, though there was the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. You're not going to let that go, are you? Izuku's heart swelled at the sight of them, his family. They had been there for him through everything, guiding him, supporting him, pushing him to grow. And now, as they stood together, it felt like the start of something new, something stronger. I'm proud of you, Izuku, Aizawa said, his voice quiet but filled with sincerity. You've come a long way. You've learned to trust yourself, and the people around you. Izuku's chest tightened with emotion, and he smiled, the warmth of their words filling him with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. Thank you. For everything. I couldn't have done it without you. You're part of our family now, Zuku, Hisashi said, his grin wide and genuine. You'll never have to do anything alone again. Izuku nodded, his heart full. He had found his family, his place in the world. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. He knew that no matter what challenges came their way, they would face them together. As the sun continued to rise, casting a golden light over the rooftop, Izuku felt a quiet sense of closure. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had brought him here, to this moment of peace, trust, and connection. And as he looked toward the future, hand in hand with Shinso, surrounded by the people who loved him, Izuku knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone. He never would be again. This is the end of Threads of Trust by the Angel Demon. I hope you liked it. If you have any suggestions, let me know. Don't forget to subscribe to know when we'll be out. Have a good day.